Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Kira and I'm from Claren Bridge, which means Small Broad Bridge, which is a small village approximately 15 minutes south of Galway in Ireland. It is on the main route from Galway to Limerick, which is at the mouth of the Claren River, west of the village of Dunbalkin Bay, where they harvest the world-famous Claren Bridge oysters, which are considered to be the best oysters in the entire world. I grew up in the 1980s in an old-fashioned village cottage-style home made of stone with a thatched roof and some modern brick conversions added to the rear side of the property due to the large extended size of our family. I was raised with 5 brothers and 4 sisters, so life was never ever dull. And we were a close, loving Irish family that never wanted for anything, although we weren't very well off in those days, but that never seemed to matter. Obviously, we wore each other's hand-me-downs and shared toys and sweets together, but love in our household was in abundant supply, and life in those days was incredibly good. One day my mother announced that our great-aunt Hilda had sent us a single air ticket for one of us kids to go and stay with her in North America, as she would like to get to know one of her nieces or nephews a little better, as during the potato famine in 1845 a portion of our family had remained in Ireland while the rest had emigrated to the States. My mother would have to decide upon which one of us would go to America, which wasn't an easy decision for her to have to undertake. As kids, who had never so much as ventured outside of Ireland before, the very idea of going abroad tickled our fancies, and we all begged our parents individually that they would consider selecting us over our siblings to go. Over dinner we waited with bated breath to see who was going to be the lucky one to visit North America, and I prayed with all my heart that it would be me. In those days, going overseas was a huge deal and a great privilege, and was something more inclined for people of wealth to undertake. "It's unfortunate that you can't all go to America," said my mother. "I do so wish things were different for us financially, but they aren't. If I had my way, I would send the lot of you over, but unfortunately only one of you can go. But the good news is that the one of you that does go can come back and tell us all about it. I'll let you know tomorrow night who will be going, as I have asked the good Lord to show me which one of you he has chosen to send." The following morning my mother shook me wide awake, as usual I had overslept and needed to get up for school, and I was always the one in our family that tended to oversleep. We both nearly jumped out of our skins when a frog darted out of our bedspread, surprising the both of us. "Where on earth did that come from?" asked my mother, looking perturbed. "It gave me quite a start," she said, picking up the frog and dropping it out of the window so that it was free to hop away to the nearby pond at the back of the yard. "You should be happy," said my sister Emma. "When there's a frog in the house, it means more money is on its way." "Well, I won't say no to that," said my mother. "We could do with a little more nectar coming our way, couldn't we?" Which was my mother's word that she used for money. Oh, I'd love to take you kids out shopping and go completely ballistic over the clothes section at the department store without burning any holes in my wallet. It would be wonderful. Imagine how much fun it would be. Maybe one day, said my sister Emma dreamily. Who knows? The tide can turn. Later that afternoon, my mother picked me up from my ballet lesson at the town hall, and a random large seagull flew over our car and deliberately eliminated and ejected its monstrously milky discharge from its rear end like a shooting water pistol over our windscreen, and the wipers had one hell of a time cleaning the muck off the glass. "Look at that," said my mother, laughing. "A volcanic explosion of bird droppings. I'd love to know the contents of that bird's stomach. My guess is he stole some poor fisherman's sandwich." That evening all 10 of us kids gathered around the long wooden oak table in our cosy kitchen, while my mother labelled us out big bowls of piping hot leek and potato soup, served with large chunks of Irish soda bread. In our kitchen the enthused, animated voices became very excitable, because before long my mother would announce who would be going to America, and the mood around the dinner table was very bright and cheerful. We said grace, and then a lone butterfly landed in my soup and almost drowned. I had to gently lift it out with my spoon and wipe down its pretty blue and yellow wings with my napkin, and we watched it fly away out of the kitchen window. "Poor thing," said my father. "Not a pretty place to land, in your soup bowl of all things." "Shh," said my mother. "Please calm down, everybody," she said, tapping her glass down heavily on the table, as the sound of excited chatter and clanging dishes was unusually noisy, which wasn't uncommon in the O'Brien household. "Shh," I said. "Everybody, please be quiet. Mum is trying to speak." And suddenly all the chirrupy voices around the table subsided, and everybody became very quiet. "I'm going to be telling you who is going to America before we eat our steak and kidney pudding," my mother announced. The hushed silence in the room intensified, as everyone was eager to hear what my mother had to say. I could see every eye was glued to her, and fists were clenched so tightly, and I noted 2 of my brothers had actually squeezed their eyes tightly shut. "Don't keep us in suspense, love," said my father. "It's killing me. I'll be having a coronary if you don't spit it out right now. Who is going, for goodness sake? Don't keep us hanging on." "Well," said my mother, "as you know, I asked the good Lord to reveal to me who it was that should be going to America. What you did not know is that I also asked him for 3 physical signs from the universe, which I have received. This morning a frog pounced out of Kira's bed, and when I picked her up from the dance class this morning, the contents of a seagull's stomach were splattered all over our windscreen on our drive back home. And last but not least, in front of all of you, a butterfly landed in her soup. It is very clear to me that God has chosen Kira." Everybody clapped. "I'm so happy for you, Kira," they all said. But I could see the downcast expressions in their eyes, and I was overwhelmed with feelings of impending guilt. "Look, Mother," I said, "put all the names in the hat, and we'll do a draw that way. That way we can't argue with who actually wins." "Oh, no," said my father. "Do we have to drag this out a moment longer? I think it's about time we ate our second course. That steak and kidney pudding is calling me from the oven. It smells delicious, and my stomach is rumbling it's turning around so much." "You're just going to have to wait, sweetheart, aren't you?" "If you're sure, Kira, about this, that's very generous of you," said my mother, writing down all my siblings' names and then putting them in a hat and offering the hat to my brother Keegan, who fiddled around in the hat and finally pulled out a name. "So what does it say?" asked my father. "It's Kira," he said, putting the paper down firmly on the table. After the draw, my siblings were unanimous that I was most certainly the one to go to America, because God had clearly singled me out for favour, and I'm not going to pretend that I was absolutely thrilled, because I was, and now I could not argue with the fact that I most definitely had been chosen, as sometimes things are just meant to be. I was 15 years old when I visited America in the spring of 1982, and as the taxi cab drove me from the airport to my Aunt Hilda's farmhouse, I could not contain the rising level of excitement and exhilaration I felt. I could feel my heart fluttering in my chest, and I couldn't erase the broad grin on my face. America seemed so large and spacious, and everything was sprawled out over a vast area that seemed to go on for an eternity, unlike Ireland, where everything was so small and contained. I sat transfixed, glued to the taxi window, mesmerised and beguiled by the scenic vistas of beautiful farms, fields of crops, charming meadows filled with grazing cows or horses, pretty red barns, undulating green countryside, and ubiquitous trees. It was the most exciting, enthralling feeling in the world to be visiting a strange, unusual and new country for the very first time in my life. "You're from Ireland," said the taxi driver, smiling at me through the rear-view mirror in his vehicle. "So, what do you think of America?" "It's beautiful," I said. "Simply beautiful. I love it." "Well, it is spring," said the driver, "and here in the bluegrass state, everything looks marvellous in the spring," he said, pointing at the pretty white blossoms of the service berries, along with the bright pink flowers of the eastern redbuds. "It's gorgeous," I admitted. "I love spring." "You see that beautiful white blossom tree over there?" said the taxi driver. "That's a Bradford pear, and when that starts to flower, we know that spring is here. And then, of course, all the yellow daffodils come out, and you find them coming up everywhere in pretty clusters. Spring is beautiful here." "It is lovely," I agreed. The taxi eventually began to drive deeper and deeper into the heart of the idyllic, exquisite countryside, which was surrounded by high grassy embankments, lined with blossoming red maples, dogwoods and oak trees. Before long we drove through a dark-stained wooden gate, with the sign Misty Frisian Hills attached to the top wooden beam. "Ah, we're here," said the taxi driver. "At last! This must be your Aunt Hilda's property." I sat at the window, completely bewitched by the resplendent scenery, as we drove down a pebbly driveway, past acres and acres of rolling, bright emerald-green countryside that glistened in the morning sun, where the blackest, most magnificent horses that I've ever seen were out grazing in the fields. Surely my aunt didn't own all this, I thought in astonishment. I mean, that would make her incredibly rich, wouldn't it? Finally, the taxi drew up outside a very attractive-looking two-storey farmhouse that was painted in lemon yellow, with pale blue shutters, large windows, and a pale blue, rather ornate front door. All of a sudden, I saw what I can only describe as an exotic butterfly emerging out of the house, with such an excitable look upon her face. It was my great-aunt Hilda, who was effusive, fulsome, and dramatic, and dressed in line with her bubbly personality, as she wore soft, flowing, bright-coloured bohemian clothes, along with a turquoise headband over her head and long, dangling golden earrings. I'd never met anyone quite like her before, and even the taxi driver looked beguiled by this bubbly, ebullient woman, with her vibrant, effervescent, sparkling personality. The woman cradled me in her arms and began to cry. "Oh, do mind me," she said gushingly. "But it's just so wonderful to see you. How I have longed for this day. I only wish all of you kids could have come, but that would have been too big a price tag to pay, as managing my farm with all my Frisian horses doesn't come very cheap." As you can imagine, I was having the time of my life with Aunt Hilda, despite the vast age difference between us, and I never felt that generational gap, as it would seem that I was spending time with someone who was so full of fun, and we did many wonderful things together. I was taken by my aunt to see wineries and breweries and visit farms, cemetery and museums, and taste all kinds of American food, and of course so much more, and I felt as if I'd known Aunt Hilda all of my life. Every morning I would get up eagerly at the crack of dawn to make my way to the large glamorous stable block, to take a long ride on Churchill, my aunt's elegant Frisian horse that was a gleaming black colour and had a powerfully muscled body, with a thick black mane and glorious tail, with feathering on his lower legs, and he possessed the most gentile, docile, easy-going personality, and in my eyes was quite the most incredible horse that I've ever met in my entire life, and for some reason there was an instantaneous bond between the two of us. I'm a naturally adventurous person by nature, and have always been a huge risk-taker, and enjoy challenging myself. And on this particular morning I decided to follow what had once been an ancient horse trail, and was clearly now abandoned and no longer in use. I could see why it had been neglected, because it was quite a precipitous trail, with rugged outcrops and some steep uphill riding, and there were many tree branches scattered liberally around the countryside, some way too big for me to move myself, but luckily Churchill knew how to navigate the tumultuous terrain, and made light work of jumping over any obtrusive treefall. After riding up a steep hilly incline, finally we arrived at a really pretty silvery stream that gushed through the valley with a forceful current. I dismounted Churchill and left her to graze and forage for a while in an open meadow, while I sat down on a large rocky outcrop, with hands over my knees, to watch the water pulsating over the smooth rocks and pebbles. I've always loved listening to gushing water and watching it. It somehow tends to put me into a tranquil, meditative state. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring into space, but before long I was lost in my thoughts, when a movement behind me suddenly got my attention aroused, and I turned around very swiftly. What was that, I wondered? I'd clearly heard a rustling of leaves, and the sound of very heavy feet moving towards me. It sounded like a bag of heavy potatoes dropping or thumping to the ground with every step. Had I imagined things, I wondered, but then I heard the sound again, very, very clearly. Twigs and leaves were being snapped under feet and broken. And it wasn't Churchill, because he was much further away, grazing happily in the long grass, blindly oblivious to my dilemma. I sat still, gazing in the direction where I believed the sound was coming from. I didn't feel afraid, but I was rather curious, for whoever was walking my way was very sizable and hefty. Maybe it was a very big person, I thought to myself, someone of ample size taking a walk. I could hear the snapping sound again, and then I could see this thorny briar being torn apart as a creature moved through it and yanked it away like you would a piece of candy floss. I mean, who in their right mind walks through a thicket of thorns without being ripped to shreds? Not anyone normal. At first I thought I was seeing a bear, as I suddenly saw this dark brown shadowy form breaking off the twigs and thundering past me, barely noticing me at first. Then this big bear-like creature stopped, as if it had suddenly become aware of my presence, and his head and shoulders swiveled around very slowly to look directly at me. I was astonished to discover that this creature was not a bear, for it had a human-like face, but what was it? I was terrified, for never in my whole life have I ever observed such an intimidating, imposing creature with such a consummate, masterful and formidable presence. It felt as if I was in striking distance of a savage beast, for this being looked to be half human and ape, almost as if someone had been experimenting with human and ape DNA in a science laboratory and merging them together to create a new life form. And this was the outlandish result. At a guess, the arresting creature was easily 8 foot tall, and was very stocky and well built, with a dense, muscular anatomy, especially across the torso region and upper shoulders, and was covered with magnificent raven black hair, like Churchill the horse, and the hair looked incredibly well groomed, but layered and thick. I noted it had long arms, much like that of a primate, and the head shape of a silverback gorilla, and more of a human-like face, although the forehead was very prominent and heavily furrowed, while the eyes deep-set and dark, and the nose almost as flat as a pug. On this particular occasion, the soft easterly wind had been blowing in the opposite direction, and I'd been so entwined in a still meditative moment, which was why the creature had not discerned me or picked up my human scent on the wind, as I am certain If that were not indeed the case, I would never have had such a chance anomalous encounter. The creature looked at me with deep-set chocolate-coloured eyes, and those eyes darted towards my hands. Maybe he wondered if I was carrying a gun, for when he saw I was unarmed, I noted the tension in his face lifted, and he visibly began to relax. I was so afraid that I sat as still as an ice statue, completely incapacitated by the most dreadful, all-consuming fear, the likes that I have never known before or since. The creature still stared at me like you and I would regard a painting, and I know it sounds crazy and nonsensical, but I felt like this strange being was either reading my energy or looking directly through me like a pane of glass. I could see the taut rigidity and tightness of the creature's jaw subside, and his muscles relaxed even more, as he sensed that I was no danger to him, and I was clearly no threat. Then he did the strangest, most peculiar thing. He scratched his head in front of me in deep contemplation, and then spoke a couple of rather musical high-pitched words in a language I could not comprehend, and I felt as if those words were directed at me. But I have no notion of what he was saying, although I wish I did. I watched in reverent awe as the majestic, lofty creature darted towards the stream, and I saw him standing in the water like bears do during the salmon run, and he began attempting to catch fish with a stick that had a jagged edge, and he was seemingly unperturbed at this stage by my presence. You would think that at this point I would have made a hasty exit out of the place as fast as I could, but it was like I was locked in some kind of a stupefied, suspended trance, and I couldn't stop staring in wondrous awe at the creature, with a look of transfixed bewilderment on my face. I kept rubbing my eyes to assure myself that I was not dreaming. All of a sudden the creature swerved his body to one side with such swift speed and agility, in coordination with his powerful swinging arms, that he thrashed forward so powerfully like a golfer hitting the ball, to stab and pierce the fish with a stick, and he whacked it against his shoulder and left it there hanging until he had caught 2 more of them. The creature glided out of the water with 3 brown trout dangling in his hands, which he had tied together with twine. Upon seeing me, he stood still for a moment as if he was making a decision, much like a kid who has 3 sweets but doesn't want to share any at all, and has a hard time parting with even one of them, but does so anyway with a degree of reluctant disinclination, knowing that it is the right thing to do after all, for it would be greedy to consume them without sharing. It was like that with the creature, as he studied his 3 fish intently, and then graciously handed me one, which I took from him, for it would have been rude not to accept his courteous, kind-hearted offer, even if it was given to me with a degree of hesitancy on his part. I then saw him pull back the thorny briars again, and glide through them, from whence he'd initially come, glancing back at me briefly for one more time, as if he was saying goodbye. I think on his part it had taken a lot for the creature to give me one of his fish, and I was secretly moved by his spontaneous act of generosity. It left me to conclude that this creature had been raised by parents who had clearly taught him the art of good manners and of male chivalry, which some parents have all but failed to accomplish with their own human prodigy. My fear turned to elation, and running with my fish I darted back to Churchill, mounting him enthusiastically, and galloped quickly back to my Aunt Hilda's house. I couldn't wait to tell her what I'd seen. On this occasion she had invited a guest over for breakfast and was preparing a full fry-up of sausage, bacon, mushrooms and eggs, along with glasses of fresh orange juice. "Where have you been, Kira dear?" she said. "My word, you look so out of breath. Kira, this is Pastor Robert Page, who has an Irish ancestry. I thought you might like to meet him." I could see that this was a young, rather dashing, handsome gentleman, and I wouldn't put anything past Aunt Hilda in trying to instigate some romantic flame between the 2 of us. But did she not realise how much older he was than me? It was never going to happen, despite her best well-meaning intentions. "Hello, Robert," I said. "Very nice to meet you." "Aunt Hilda, you won't believe what's just happened to me back there," I said, handing her the large brown trout. "I was riding Churchill, and you—" "Calm down, dear. "Where did you get this beauty from?" said my aunt, examining the trout in amazement. "Who gave you this?" she asked, looking at me with a mystified expression on her face. "A very strange creature, Aunt. It was half human, and it was half ape. You won't believe it." "Kira, what on earth are you talking about, dear? There is no such creature living here in North America," said my aunt, placing her hand on my head to see if I was running a temperature. "Are you sure you're all right, dear?" she said. "I think you do feel rather hot and clammy. I'm worried you might be coming down with something." "Aunt Hilda, I feel hot because I've been out riding Churchill. I'm not running a fever." "You should know that exercise makes you hot," I said, looking exceedingly frustrated. "You can doubt my story as much as you like, Aunt Hilda, but I'm not making this up," I said, reaching for a pen and paper and frantically drawing the creature I'd seen and thrusting it into her face. "Aunt Hilda, that's what I saw." Aunt Hilda studied the picture that I had drawn with a bemused expression on her face and hastily began to serve up our breakfast. "I'm so sorry, Pastor. Well, Kira, you know, being new to America," she laughed dismissively, "has no experience with the wildlife here. I'm quite sure she saw a bear and has just mistaken it for something very, very strange." "Aunt Hilda," I piped, "I'm not a complete, utter idiot. We may not have bears in Ireland, but I assure you I do know what a bear looks like. I have actually been to a zoo before. But this wasn't a bear. It had a human face, only it was covered in hair. Believe me, I'm telling you the truth." "I happen to believe your niece's story, Hilda," said the young pastor. "I think she did see what she claims to have encountered. It isn't the first time I've heard of such an incongruous rendezvous before. For indeed my father spoke of a similar experience that had occurred to him after a member of his congregation had visited him because of huge issues to do with anxiety." "Really?" said Aunt Hilda. "Well, what happened?" "Well, my father told me the whole story. It happened in the June of 1965. The young man in question was called Brodie, and he came to tell my father that he believed that God was punishing him because he had done something very iniquitous and evil, and that as a result he was now being visited by a demon, and he was very, very afraid. He claimed that during the night he would wake up to see this huge, hairy face with bright red eyes staring at him through the bedroom window. Brodie was in such a dreadful state, and he was shaking all over like a jelly. Very discomposed he was. My father asked him if he would feel better confessing his sin to him in person, and Brodie hung his head in shame and said, 'May God forgive me for what I've done, Father. Truly, I am very ashamed. I stole some money from an old lady. A lot of money,' he stammered, his face growing red with embarrassment. 'I know I should not have done such an irreverent and heathen thing, Father. I think it was all her life savings that she kept in a pillow under her bed.' I learnt about her secret stash of money because I was friends with her grandson, who told me that his grandmother was not trusting of any banks, so she hid her money in one of her pillows. I climbed through the open window when the woman was out shopping and stole all her money, and I spent it all. Oh, Father, I am so ashamed. After I'd done this profane thing, I felt such self-disgust and revulsion, and I've been tormented ever since, for I have seen a demon outside my window a couple of times at night, and I am terrified he is intending on taking me back to the fiery pit of hell. Father, what should I do?" "So you took this old lady's money," my father said to Brodie in disgust. "That is a shocking, immoral thing for you to do. You know how protective our Heavenly Father is towards the orphan and the widow. You have done a grievous, very shameful thing, but the Lord is faithful to forgive the repentant heart. But I think you need to make restitution to the poor widow, for you cannot deprive her of her life savings, as that is indeed reprehensible and sacrilegious." "I'll do anything, Father, anything to make amends," piped Brodie. "I just can't pay the money back, because I spent it all. Otherwise I would return it to her in a heartbeat. Anything to stop that demon from coming back."
"Well, I believe you, Brodie. There are ways you can make up for your misdemeanours. You do have the ability to work, have you not?"
"Of course, Father. Anything you suggest, you name it, I'll do it."
"My father decided that the church would give the old woman all her money back that had been stolen by Brodie, and got him to return the money to the old lady in person, and to apologise profusely for what he had done. Thankfully, she hadn't realised the money had been stolen, as Brodie had surreptitiously filled her pillow with newspaper cuttings. Even so, the woman gave Brodie her blessing, and assured him that he was indeed forgiven. I gather she was a lovely, gentle old dear, and not a bad bone in her body was seen. 'We all make mistakes, Brodie,' she said, 'but you understood the error of your ways, and as you have returned my money, why should I be aggrieved?' In return for the church's help, Brodie had to compensate the church. He was to clean it up every Sunday after the people had left the service, including cleaning up all the toilets, which wasn't a job for the faint-hearted, and he was also expected to help the old lady keep her house clean and do any shopping and chores for her during the week, and the old lady and Brodie became the best of friends, but that is a whole other story. Of course, Brodie begged my father to visit his home that evening and make intercession for him by praying for his soul to our loving Father and sprinkling holy water all over the place. My father said he discovered that outside Brodie's bedroom window was the biggest footprint he'd ever seen, that was too big to be made by a regular man, nor was it made by a bear. My father was well acquainted with bear tracks from his hunting days as a boy, so he knew the intruder outside the window was not a bear, and if he had looked through the Brodie's window, he would have had to have been easily 8 foot tall. This was when he came to the startling revelation that the demonical being staring in at Brodie's room at night was not of a supernatural origin, but was clearly physical. But he was puzzled as to what it was that Brodie had actually seen. "I understood from my father that Brodie lived here in the Bluegrass State, on one of those remote roads, and as my father was leaving Brodie's cabin in the woods, the headlights of his black Dodger Charger lit up a creature in the dirt road. My father was so astonished that he stalled the car and struggled to get it to start again. Of course, he could not believe what he was seeing, and described the creature as being 8 foot tall and exceedingly wide, with a huge barrel chest and massive shoulders, and appeared to be covered in long flowing dark hair, blacker than black. He described the creature as having the face of a man. It cowered in the light of my father's headlights, as it seemed to detest the light that was streaming in its eyes. But it looked directly at my father in the front passenger seat, and my father said in certain lights the creature's eyes exhibited a red eye shine. But my father wasn't afraid, despite the fact that the creature was intimidating in presence to behold. But as a man of God, he sensed the creature meant no harm, and described it as having beautiful, kind eyes. My father believed that eyes were indeed the windows of the soul, conveying the very heart of a man. My father said the creature glided away, moving with such grace into the darkness of the night. It was easy to see such a creature could easily have been mistaken or misconstrued for a demon. He was certain that this curious creature had probably been staring in Brodie's bedroom window at night, scaring the man half to death. My father began to laugh so much on his return journey home, saying that the good Lord had a great sense of humour, for Brodie had been brought to repentance as a result of this elusive creature staring at him through the window at night that he so believed was a demon. "Wow," I said. "You see, Aunt Hilda, I wasn't making it up. The creature is real, it exists, and I'm willing to bet you, Robert, that your father saw exactly what I saw." "I think it's very likely indeed," said Robert.
"But I don't understand," said Aunt Hilda. "Why do we not know about these things, then?"
"Because, Hilda," said Robert reflectively, "wouldn't it be a very boring world if we knew the answers to everything? I think an aura of mystery in our lives makes the world a very exciting place indeed.
As you can imagine, when I left Aunt Hilda's home in North America to return to Ireland, I was able to tell all my excited siblings some incredible stories about my amazing North American trip around a crackling fire at night, with all eyes pinned on me, growing wider and wider as I told my extraordinary story. For no one doubted it to be true, for here in Ireland we believe in the fae and in elves and goblins, so why not this elusive mythical beast? All my siblings began to speculate what the incongruous creature was that I encountered, and it was only 15 years ago that I realised I had a one-on-one encounter with a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I studied the pale, gaunt and somewhat anxious patient in the bed at the hospital, and was heartily relieved to see that she was making steady progress, as when she first arrived in the ER, she'd lost so much blood from a lethal open gash to her femoral artery on her leg. Things looked very grim for her long-term prognosis, but it seemed that miraculously the blood transfusion and efficient surgery had brought her back from the very brink of death. In my experience, injuries like hers are almost unsurvivable, because the blood loss can be so extreme that sometimes medical intervention comes just far too late. But luckily for my patient, against all odds, she miraculously survived. When she first arrived in the ER, she looked like an insipid, waif-like raw sausage, as she was scratched up so badly with deep, long vertical lacerations and cuts that were entrenched in her skin. It looked like she'd been sliced by a very sharp razor knife, and she was covered in her own blood from top to toe. And I remember her frightened blue eyes looked at me through this iron-rich red face mask, and her faint words were begging me to help her. "Please, please don't let me die. I don't want to die. Please don't let me die," she had whispered on the gurney before she had drifted into unconsciousness. It was a bear attack, I'd been told, and I'm sorry, but I wasn't buying into that story, which I vehemently repudiated and discounted for a bear, as in my experience, bears do not attack in this way. I could see the family gathering around the young girl's hospital bed, and they looked concerned and apprehensive, whispering among themselves, and I knew in my gut that the family were being unusually secretive, and there was something that they were hiding and suppressing from the doctors. But that is not altogether unusual in my experience, as patients do often hide secrets from their doctors. "How is Elaine doing, doctor?" Mrs. Piper asked me, looking concerned. "She is going to be all right, isn't she?" "Your daughter's case is fascinating," I said to Mrs. Piper. "She is indeed very lucky to be alive. We very nearly lost her in the ER. It was a touch-and-go situation in there for a while. I'm not going to lie. I would go so far as to say it really is quite a miracle that she is alive." "But she is going to be fine, isn't she, doctor?" said Mrs. Piper. "I mean, she will make 100% full recovery, won't she?" "I am not concerned about your daughter's physical progress, Miss Piper. On the contrary, she's doing remarkably well, and I expect her to make 100% recovery. But I am very worried about her mental well-being. It seems your daughter is suffering from severe post-traumatic distress disorder. I've reports from the nurses that were working last night that your daughter was screaming and kicking during her sleep and was engaged in a terrifying nightmare, almost as if she was fighting off an attacker. The alarmed nurses had to wake her up to calm her down and give her some sedatives. I do think she's going to need to see a psychiatrist, because she is seriously traumatized from her experience, and I'm afraid it is emotional wounds that leave the longest-lasting scars." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Piper. "What are you trying to say, doctor? Are you saying my daughter is mentally unstable?" "I'm not saying anything of the sort, Mrs. Piper. You've got me completely wrong. Your daughter is mentally stable and very sound in mind, but she is deeply traumatized and disturbed." "Are you sure this was a bear attack, Mrs. Piper?" I asked her. Mrs. Piper looked as if her face had grown as white as a sheet. She was intentionally evasive and prevaricating, avoiding any kind of eye contact with me. I could see she wasn't a good liar at all. "Of course it was a bear attack, Doctor," she said ambiguously, her brown frightened eyes looking guarded and non-committal. "Oh, sorry, Doctor, I completely forgot. I better get going quickly," she said, incorporating the art of distraction to try and avoid any more uncomfortable questions from me. She promptly said, oh dear, I'm running so late. I need to get back to the farmhouse at once. I've completely forgotten to feed the chickens. Oh, my word. Goodbye, sweetheart. I'll see you soon later," she said, planting a kiss on Elaine's forehead. "Come, kids, we need to get going now," she said, addressing her kids. "But we've only just got here, Mum," said her daughter Amy. "I thought we were staying with Elaine a little longer," she complained. "We're going now," snapped Mrs. Piper in a formidable voice that sounded more like a bark, and the three of them scuttled out of the hospital obediently, all too aware that their mother's onerous tone of voice could not be challenged. It seemed like my questions had ruffled her feathers. I smiled to myself. People were very funny. I'd seen it working in the hospital over and over again, and I was astute about reading body language, and evasive, indeterminate behaviour and guarded secrets were never uncommon in hospitals among my patients. Other doctors would probably just have shrugged their shoulders in a nonchalant way and said, "Well, I don't want to get involved anyway. But something stinks about this case, but who cares? I'll just turn a blind eye to it." But not me. I'm inquisitive and curious by nature and like to connect all the dots. Furthermore, I'm fascinated by things that cannot be explained. I knew without a shadow of a doubt I had to get to the bottom of this intriguing, inexplicit and enigmatic mystery, come hell or high water. So I quickly pulled the curtain around my patient's bed for some privacy and pulled up a chair to the side of Elaine's bed. "How are you feeling today, Elaine?" I asked. I'm fine, Doctor," she said, looking at me awkwardly. Thanks for saving my life, Doctor. I really mean that. I'm very, very grateful. I really thought I was going to die." "Well, it was touch and go for a minute," I said, "but you're a very lucky girl, and a big fighter at that. I think your determination to live helped a lot. The mind is a very powerful thing, you know." "I really thought I was going to die, Doctor," said Elaine again. "It was so weird, but the moment I started to bleed out, I could feel myself fading, and I knew I was slipping away. It wasn't unpleasant. It was rather like a floating feeling. But it scared me, because I really didn't want to leave my body." "Well, the life is in the blood, isn't it?" I said. "So invariably when you lose too much blood, that's when people pass away. That's what usually happens if you lose too much. But you were one of our miraculous cases, I'm very happy to have to say. Now, Elaine, I'd like you to be truthful with me for a moment. I assure you that I will keep what you tell me in the strictest of confidence, but I happen to know that you were certainly not attacked by a bear." "How do you know, Doctor?" stammered Elaine, looking fretful and anguished. "My mother didn't tell you, did she? Because she doesn't want anybody to know what happened to me. She's petrified of anyone learning the truth." "I know you weren't attacked by a bear, Elaine, because in my experience a bear tends to knock people over with its paws. It tends to bite the upper arm and leg, and often snaps the neck. But you were not attacked like that. Some of your wounds are remarkably like a sharp knife that has been deliberately pierced through your skin in long vertical cuts, like someone deliberately using a cutting instrument." "Doctor, I can't tell you what happened. My family, they told me to say that it was a bear. I can't break that promise to them." "Why? I don't understand," I asked. "Whom are you trying to protect? Is someone in your family deliberately hurting you?" Elaine's eyes grew round like saucers. "Doctor, we're just trying to protect our own sanity. If anyone was to hear our story, they would definitely think it was fictitious. They would never, ever believe us. They would think we were as nutty as fruitcakes and that we belonged in the funny farm. We don't want people to think we're completely loopy, Doctor." That's a bit extreme, I said. Why don't you tell me what really happened? And I won't judge you, however bizarre your story is. Believe me, I've seen some things in my time that would most certainly make your hair curl. Working as a doctor, sometimes with dying patients, I have experienced paranormal phenomena, so I'm very open to your story, however peculiar and incongruous it may sound. Besides, you have clearly been very traumatized, and in my experience, it really helps to talk about what happened. Doctor, I'm scared to tell you, said Elaine. I'm frightened you won't believe me, she said, tears pouring down her face. It was big, it was horrible, it was grotesque, monstrous, and the most hideously ugly thing that I've ever seen. Well, why don't you start from the very beginning? It's my lunch break now, so I have plenty of time on my hands to listen, and I'm a great listener, I assure you. I watched Elaine as she composed herself. Well, we recently moved to the countryside in Washington. We used to live in Seattle, but Dad decided we should move to a place outside Shelton, very close to Toano State Park, which I think is about an hour-and-a-half drive from Seattle. You see, my father only has to be in his office twice a week, so it's not that too far for him to commute. It's situated close to the shoreline of the Hood Canal, and is a very warm saltwater beach. Yes, I think I am actually rather familiar with Toano State National Park. I seem to remember I went camping there once when I was a young girl, and lots of fun we had there too, I might add. I think we'd go down to the beach when the tide was in. We'd swim and picnic and sunbathe. It was glorious. Those were the days. Good, so you know the area then. Well, we bought a beautiful property on 50 acres of rolling, verdant green countryside, and about 6 months ago, after all the renovations to our home were complete, we finally moved in. My mother has an architect's degree, and had in mind to build a very unique rustic-style Italian farmhouse there in the countryside, built out of natural stone with a large black-tiled roof, archways and high ceilings, and very big spacious windows. It was stunningly beautiful, a very natural result, and looked like something that you'd expect to see in the Tuscan countryside, as it's quaint and charming. So my mother's masterful designs were very brilliant. My two sisters and I were very excited about the move, namely because of all the space and the exquisite panoramic views there, because believe me, where we live now is so beguiling. I would wake up in the morning and actually pinch myself and say, "Do you really live in such a paradise?" I couldn't believe it. You see, we've been raised in a very small apartment in Seattle where you could barely swing a cat. Pardon the pun. The majority of the land on our property is densely wooded, with a mixture of statuesque, rather majestic hardwood and pine trees, and it has so many ATV and walking trails on the property, and is teeming with birds, waterfowl and wildlife, and we have a fabulous silvery lake on the edge of the wood green, surrounded by weeping willows and well stocked with fish. I've even seen bald eagles around there a lot, and I've collected some of their feathers. Oh my word, those birds, they're absolutely phenomenal. I've never seen anything like them. They just beguile me so much. Well, every day when we were free from the demands of our homework, my sisters and I would take our ATVs out and ramble around the countryside down some of those ATV parts, because it's so fun just getting out into the country, listening to the fabulous bird song and encountering a deer or a fox or something like that. It's so peaceful and so uplifting. Well, of course it is, I said. I heartily agree. In my experience, Mother Nature is a miraculous healer. If I have a depressed patient, I'll often suggest they take some long walks in the countryside. And guess what? When they come back, they're almost completely cured. Well, I can believe that, said Elaine reflectively. I think nowadays we deprive ourselves of going out as much as we should, and people get cabin fever without even knowing it, and wonder why they're feeling down. Anyway, back to my story. It was a few days ago, before my accident, my sisters and I were driving our ATVs down these mountainous trails, when suddenly we smelt the foulest, most disgusting smell that we have ever discerned before. It was so vile that I had to park my ATV at the side of the trail and throw up the entire contents of my stomach into the thick bushes. I was seriously sick. Believe me, I hurled up everything. It wasn't pleasant. My sisters were grievously concerned about me and asked me if I was all right, because I was shaking so much. The smell was so discomposing, rather like a decaying corpse with sulphurous undertones. It was absolutely revolting. All of a sudden, I remember I had this ominous feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes. I don't know how to describe it to you, but it felt very much as if something was just staring at us. I don't know why, but I looked up, and that was when I saw the 7-foot bipedal creature standing on a tree branch, and he balanced on it with such poise and grace. He was looking down at us with the meanest, most malevolent and hateful eyes that I have ever seen. But I could tell he was intelligent. I think all three of us had seen the creature, as our ATVs had just stopped, and we were all looking up at the very same large oak tree. I truly think we were confounded by what we were perceiving, as this was not something we even imagined could exist in modern-day America, and we had no idea what on earth it was. So despite our terror, I think we were transfixed by this startling anomaly.
So what did this animal actually look like? I asked.
Well, it was covered in jet black hair, and when I say black, I mean the blackest black that you can think of, which was the length of about a short-haired German shepherd dog all over its body. It had the face of a wolf, with pointed upturned ears, and it had a jaw full of pointed canine teeth that looked like deadly weapons or sharp daggers. But its body was shaped exactly like a man, only much, much bigger. And the claws on this thing were like vertical knives on the edges of this human-like hands, so I suppose those knives were like his nails. And whatever this thing was, it had a long black tail like a panther that was swishing backwards and forwards, very much like an agitated cat. It was similar to the hair standing on end of a normal domestic cat, because this creature's tail grew much bushier by the second, and I've seen our cat Tabitha do that very same thing when she's not happy. This thing, whatever in God's name it was, appeared to be swinging the branch above his head backwards and forwards as it watched us. And then it unleashed a savage growl and snarled at us, exposing its jaw full of dagger-sharp like teeth. It was the most terrifying thing that I've ever witnessed. And that growl, the growl that this thing made, was more vicious and unsettling and intimidating than that of a great lion. It almost physically disorientated me, as a feeling of total dread swept over me, and I instinctively sensed that this creature wanted blood, and my blood at that, for he was sniffing the air, and his focus was pinned directly on me, not my sisters, me, almost like he'd singled me out for his dinner. My sister Amy shouted, "Go, go, go! Get out of here quickly!" But I was almost immobilised by fear. I was shaking so much like a jelly that I could barely start up the engine. It was a very distressing feeling, and I could hear my sisters moving away on their ATVs very fast, but I was lagging far behind. Finally, I got my ATV started, and then I heard a loud thud, and I instinctively knew that this creature had jumped off the tree branch onto the ground, much like a domestic pussycat, as his agility was utterly extraordinary. In that moment, this thing pounced on my ATV and turned it upside down in one seamless move. I went rolling down the slight hilly elevation until my body came to a grinding stop. The next thing I knew, this thing pounced on top of me and began to lash at me with his claws, and they were so sharp. But the funny thing was, he didn't attempt to bite me at all. It was like he was using his talons to tear me apart.
In that moment, I can't believe it, but I was startlingly calm and I didn't feel any pain at all, even though he'd ripped right through my flesh with his razor-like talons, and he even licked off some of the blood on his long nails, and I could tell he loved the taste of it, because he had a very satisfied look in his eyes, almost like, "This is delicious." I could hear my sister's terrified screams, because they were eyewitnesses to this blood-curdling scene unfolding before their eyes. They said they felt this sense of helplessness, like they had to watch me being consumed by a predator. All of a sudden, I heard this huge commotion, like something monstrously huge was bolting through the thicket like a rhino on full charge. And I remember thinking, "Please God, no, not another one of these monsters." And that was when I saw a completely different creature that looked so human-like, but was colossally big. It was easily 10 foot tall and much more powerfully built than the creature that was actually attacking me. I would describe his body as hefty, burly, and Herculean in size. This incongruous humanoid hairy creature began to attack the wolf-like humanoid that had initially been attacking me. And as it lunged towards this creature, it indicated for me with its arm to go, and I saw it had the kindest brown eyes that I've ever seen. As my ATV was toppled over and was far too heavy for me to lift up, I ran towards my sister's and got onto hers, and I turned around to see that the creature that had rescued me was punching this wolf-like humanoid viciously hard and thumping his head against the ground, and was on top of this thing. But this wolf-like thing was putting up a huge fight, and we could hear growls and snarls and hisses and screams and grunts. It was terrifying. Of course, my sister rushed me into the house and called emergency services, and I was starting to bleed out very fast from the gash in my leg, which was beginning to open up. So my sister made a tourniquet. I kept hearing my mother say, "We're going to lose my baby. She's dying." Oh, that freaked me out, let me tell you. "Wow," I said, "that is some story." "Well, it's not exactly over," said Elaine. "You see, after I was in ER and I was stabilised and my parents told that I was going to live, they went back to the scene of the accident, and they found so much blood on the ground where the attack had occurred between those two creatures that my father said that one of those beings did not survive that attack based on the amount of blood he found. It goes without saying we were obviously very concerned that the kindly creature that had come to my defence and rescue had not ended up being killed by that wolf-like demonical creature. We couldn't be sure what the outcome actually was. That night my sister couldn't get any sleep. She was fretting so much because I was still in hospital. She happened to glance out of her bedroom window that overlooks the woods, as she was certain she'd heard a strange sound. My parents had left all the outside lights on in the property, so my sister saw this dark, shadowy humanoid form creeping silently towards our home, and in his overlong arms he was carrying my ATV, almost as if it was a toy car, and he put it down outside the front porch. She could see it was the creature that had come to my rescue, who she believes without a doubt is a Bigfoot, but she could see that it had been badly cut up from the fight, but it was absolutely fine, thank goodness. She said she watched it gliding into the woods, and she said this overwhelming peace came over her, knowing that the Bigfoot is out there protecting us and our family. It most certainly must have killed that wolf-like humanoid. I'm so relieved about that, let me tell you. "Wow," I said, "what an extraordinary story. And yes, I believe every single word of it. I've always believed in the existence of Bigfoot, but that other creature you encountered, well, I can't fathom what it is. But I do believe in strange cryptid-like creatures. It would be nonsensical to think that all those forests we have here in North America are not inhabited by things that we may never have actually seen." "Now it's your turn," said Elaine. "And by the way, I have lots of spare time as well, and I'm a great listener too." "What do you mean it's my turn?" I chuckled. "Well, you did say working at this hospital here, you've seen things that have made your hair curl.
"Oh, that," I said. "It's nothing worth talking about, really." "Are you kidding?" said Elaine. "It's your turn. Now, fair's fair. I told you my story. Now you need to tell me yours." "Well, let's think," I said. "I had a patient once who came to accident and emergency after having been shot in the chest. The prognosis didn't look good at all, but it seemed he had pulled through and was recovering well, and everybody believed he was finally on the mend. Well, I was sitting at my desk, filing some reports on all my patients, and I looked up and saw my patient sitting on the swivel chair opposite me, and I looked up in surprise and said, 'What are you doing here, Johnny? You need to get back to your ward right now. You shouldn't be walking around like this in your condition. You need to recuperate.' 'But doctor,' he protested, 'I feel fantastic. In fact, I've never felt better. The pain has miraculously gone.' 'Well, that's because the painkillers are working well, Johnny, but you need to get back to the ward. You shouldn't be sitting up.' 'But, doctor,' he protested, 'can I not sit here with you for just a moment?' I had 2 more reports to file, so reluctantly I agreed. I wasn't very happy to have this patient of mine wandering around the hospital after a serious shooting injury. I was typing in my report of the motorcycle accident that had come in half an hour ago. Johnny looked at me and said something very peculiar. He said, 'Of course, the motorcyclist is not going to make it. His grandmother, the one with the bright red hair, has been waiting for him since very early this morning. She's come to collect him.' Of course, I didn't pay much attention to Johnny, as I was so focused on filing my reports and taking down all the details. I turned around and told Johnny to come with me because I wanted to take him back to the ward and make sure he obeyed my instructions. He walked alongside me. When I finally entered the ward, Johnny's bed was occupied by another patient. I said to the nurse, 'Why is someone lying in Johnny's bed? This bed belongs to Johnny.' She said to me, 'Oh, doctor, didn't you know? Johnny died an hour ago.' I told her she was wrong and turned around to address Johnny, and he had just vanished. I was so confused and overwhelmed by the experience, as Johnny had appeared to me as solid and physical as you or I, and yet he must have been a ghost. I discovered that the victim of the motorbike accident had indeed died, and I remembered Johnny's ominous words. I went to inform his parents that he'd been tragically killed, and we could do nothing to save his life. Of course, the parents were completely devastated, but the mother said to me, 'I hope he'll be with his grandmother now.' I said, 'Is that the one with the bright red hair?' She looked at me in astonishment and said, 'How could you know that?' I just said, 'I had a feeling.' 'Wow, that is a story,' laughed Elaine. 'You must have fascinating experiences being a doctor. I think I might become a doctor myself one day.' Fast forward about 15 years, and Elaine was true to her words. She became a very good doctor, working in the hospital alongside me. So it's a very small world indeed. I'm glad to say that with a little counselling, she overcame her trauma and believes that Bigfoot saved her life. She thinks he still lives out there in her woods. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was about 12 years old when I went to stay at my Uncle Fitzgerald's dairy farm with my best friend Shane. It was in the summer of 2006, and both my parents decided that it wasn't half a bad idea to offload me on my uncle for the summer holidays, as both of his children and his Spanish wife Adriana were abroad staying with her relatives in Spain. My aunt was a Spanish language teacher who taught English-speaking people how to speak Spanish, including my Uncle Fitzgerald, which was how they ultimately met. She was desirous for her 3 teenage daughters, who were my older cousins, to become much more familiarised and acquainted with their Spanish roots. I believe she was from a quaint, rather charming village in Spain called Tejada, where the houses all have white walls and red terracotta roofs, and are situated in the stunningly beautiful mountainous interior, which is very scenic. Adriana was more than a little eager to show her children Spanish oil production, from the picking of the olives to the pressing of them and to the making of the oil.
She also wanted them to see the difference between the olive oil you buy at the shops and fresh olive oil. She wanted their grandmother to teach them how to cook paella, gazpacho and tortellini, and possibly learn to speak a little Spanish in the process. Oh, I really hope she'll teach them how to speak Spanish, because it's not going to come from me, she had told my mother. My mother was very persuasive about my going to stay at my uncle's for the summer. It'll do you good, James, she had said to me, to stay in the countryside with your uncle. And besides, I'm sure he will appreciate your company. It'll be awfully lonely for him without the family around, especially without that feisty, flamboyant Spanish wife of his. You have no experience of country life, and I think it'll be great for you to see the everyday mechanics of running a dairy farm. Your father and I grew up on farms, and I feel that your sheltered upbringing here in New York is robbing you of learning more about the natural world. I'm not adverse to going, I said, but I don't want to go alone, that's all. Can I take a friend with me? I'd asked. I don't see why not, my mother had said. Why don't you get Shane to tag along for the ride? I'll pay for both of your plane tickets to Idaho, along with taxi rides to your uncle's farm. I know you're going to enjoy yourself so much, but not too much, please, because I don't want to have to drag you back from his farm to New York, kicking and screaming. Oh, Mum, stop exaggerating, I laughed. I doubt I'm going to enjoy myself that much. I mean, let's face it, how much is there to do in the countryside anyway? Not much, I imagine. Idaho, said Shane, his eyes lighting up excitedly when I invited him to join me to stay on my uncle's farm. Mum says it's 35 hours' drive in a car from New York to Idaho. That's a long time. And it only takes 3 hours to get there by plane, he told me. I can't wait to go. I've never spent time on a working farm before, and Mum says there are lots and lots of farms out in Idaho. I think it's going to be so much fun. I will never forget the taxi drive to my Uncle Fitzgerald's farm. It's strange, I know, but there are some things that are etched on your memory for a lifetime. Shane had his nose pinned to the window on the right-hand side of the taxi and was smudging the window with dirty white marks, while mine was pinned to the left. We drove past emerald green idyllic countryside, timbered mountains, jagged peaks, V-shaped valleys, prairies and fields strewn with bright yellow sunflowers, or pale blue flax flowers, or the orange and red safflowers, which are thistle, high-branched, herbaceous plants. All was breathtakingly beautiful, as nothing is more beguiling and bedazzling than endless fields of flowers. There were also pastoral meadows filled with grazing cows, horses or sheep. It was indeed a far cry from New York City, for Shane and I were much more accustomed and well acquainted with the heavy traffic, beeping taxi horns, hundreds of people hurriedly rushing to work for the daily commute, and a city bustling with activity on a daily basis. Even at night, despite the fact that my family lived in a double-storey detached home along the Hudson River that was supposed to afford us some peace and quiet along the waterfront, it was invariably always busy. It didn't matter what time of the day or night it actually was, I would always hear the murmur of voices or someone's background music blaring loudly in the distance. I only had to glance out of our apartment window to see some kind of activity going on in the street below, for it would seem that New York never ever slept. There was always so much going on. I could feel my heart beating excitedly as the taxi drove past an open expanse of rolling emerald green countryside. We took a swift turning to the right and drove through a cattle gate, signposted the Fitzgerald Dairy. We drove through a very smooth, long driveway, past pastures filled with free-range black and white dairy cows. I only had faint, rather vague memories of my Uncle Fitzgerald, who I'd only seen when I was 9 years old, and that seemed like a long time ago for me. He came dashing out of the stylized front door of their attractive colonial revival farmhouse, with its stunning whitewashed walls and contrasting red roof that was lined with terracotta tiles and possessed very prominent stylized arched windows. I could see the house was aligned with pretty curves and arches, giving it a quintessential Mediterranean touch, which must be due to the influences of his dynamic Spanish wife, and it certainly made you feel as if you were on holiday in the Mediterranean. My Uncle Fitzgerald greeted us with a broad beam on his face, and I knew at once that I liked him a lot. My uncle was slender and about 6'3", with a receding hairline and the brightest blue eyes I've ever seen. He ran towards the taxi and embraced Shane and I with big, warm, affectionate hugs, and there was no formality in his open friendliness towards us, and I got the distinct impression he was exceedingly happy to have us around.
"Welcome to Idaho, James. Oh, how good it is to see you again. It's been an awfully long time since I last saw you. And goodness, haven't you grown up a lot since then?"
"Well, that's not surprising. Last time I saw you, I was only 9.
"Well, then that explains a great deal," he said. "Oh, and this must be your friend Shane."
"That's right," said Shane, smiling warmly at my uncle. "I'm James's friend."
"Well, I'm so glad you both were able to come, because the house was awfully lonesome without you both, as my wife and children are sunning themselves in Spain. But don't you worry a brass farthing, kids, because we are going to have a far better holiday than they are. Is that a deal?"
"Deal," I said, giving my uncle the high five. "I've never been on a dairy farm before, sir," said Shane. "Is this place really all yours? It's awfully big."
"This is all mine," said my uncle, pulling out our suitcases from the trunk of the taxi and bustling us into the cosy kitchen while he took our cases to the top-floor bedroom.
There was an elderly lady with white hair and a jolly disposition, washing dishes at the sink, and she welcomed us with a warm, friendly smile. "Welcome, kid," she said, smiling at us. "I'm so relieved you've come. And we finally have some young blood back in the house again. I've been beginning to suffer from that empty nest syndrome. It's been awfully dull without Madam and her 3 rambunctious kids here in the house." My uncle returned to the kitchen.
"This is our housekeeper, Dotty," he told us. "She keeps things in apple pie order and does all the delicious cooking around here. I don't know how we would manage without her. If you boys get hungry at any time, ask Dotty here to rustle you something up, because she's a sensational cook."
"Thank you, Fitzgerald," said Dotty, smiling. "I don't always get compliments from the horse's mouth like this," she teased. Before long, my uncle was taking us on a trip around his farm on the back of our very own terrain quad bikes that were really fun to navigate around the countryside. We were able to learn all about the workings of the farm and were introduced to many of his employees, who eyed us with a wary reticence and sceptical interest. I could almost sense that they considered us to be 2 city boys way out of our depth, who were like 2 fish out of water in the countryside. I even happened to overhear one worker say to another,
"You can see those boys are from New York. They haven't got a clue as to what the heck is going on the farm. Look at their hands. They're pathetic. Soft as a baby's bottom. You mark my words, they've never got them dirty a day in their lives, except when playing sport on the field at school." "You're right," said the other man. "They're in way over their heads. My bet is they'll get bored out of their skulls on the farm and go running back to mummy, because it's too much like blood, sweat and tears for the likes of them." I could hear the men chuckling, and I was feeling ever so slightly peeved off by those unkind assumptions. Let's not kid, I was insulted, and from thenceforth I became consciously aware of everybody else's hands. I noticed my uncle's were heavily calloused and battle-weary, as indeed were all his workers. It was indeed true. Shane and I had soft fingers that made us look puny, diminutive, delicate and feeble, which made me feel very emasculated. I made a prompt decision then and there that I was going to show these contemptuous, perfunctory and disparaging country folk that this string bean of a New York boy was more than just a pretty face with soft, enfeebled fingers, for I would show them, when push comes to shove, I was about as tough as you could get, despite my small size. "This is my large, very special bull," said my uncle proudly, directing us towards the pen, where we saw the most powerful, majestic animal that was much more densely muscular than any of the cows, for it had thick bones, very wide, broad shoulders, large feet, and an exceedingly powerful neck, let alone a large bony head with protective ridges over the eyes. I noticed it had short black hair on the body that appeared curlier and woollier on the head and neck. This bull appeared very uncongenial, antagonistic, and none too pleased to see us, and it let out a rather frightful bellow that caused my hair to stand on end. "He is a beauty," I said, "but exceedingly intimidating. What's his name, Uncle?" I asked curiously. "His name is Inky. He's a great masculine specimen, based on his size and his hefty shoulders. You can always tell a good bull by the size of their shoulders. The larger, the more impressive. But you do need to be wary of him, because he is very aggressive. Make sure you never go out into that field over there. You see the one there with the white-poled fencing? The one that's adjacent to the wood green? Well, when he goes out there grazing, he could easily charge you, and a charging bull could make light work of slowing down a young men like yourselves, turning you both into beef burgers. Look at the size of him. He's a colossal, very impressive creature." "How much do you think he weighs?" I asked curiously. "Oh, easily over 1,500 pounds, probably more." "Wow, that is big, Uncle Fitzgerald. But if he is so aggressive and dangerous like you say, why did you get him in the first place?" I asked. "Couldn't you have selected a bull with a calmer temperament? I know if I was selecting a bull and I was in your position, I would choose one that was much more friendly. Inky looks like he's cantankerous, belligerent and disagreeable, if you don't mind me saying so. I mean, he has about as much charm as a snapping turtle, and they don't have any charm at all." "Well, it's very simple," said my uncle. "He is my herd sire. He has a high genetic merit for milk yield, which means all his daughters will produce lots and lots of milk for me. I acquired Inky as he had a great ancestral history and production records of the sire and dam that are exceedingly impressive. I didn't get him based on his vibrant personality. Let's face it, he doesn't have one. But he's a stubborn old fellow, he is. Very set in his ways. The trouble with Inky, he's so in love with Sylvia, one of our female cows, and pays all the other females in the herd little to no attention at all, which is exceedingly annoying for me. He only seems to have eyes for Sylvia, who thinks she's a cut above the other cows, because Inky lavishes all his attention on her. I end up having to artificially inseminate my own cows with Inky's sperm, because that's how difficult he is." "Well, maybe he's monogamous," I joked, "and doesn't want to be unfaithful to Sylvia." "Well, you could be right there, son," laughed my uncle. "Now I'm going to get you to taste real milk. Not the dreadful pasteurized stuff you get from the supermarket," he said, leading us back to the farmhouse into the kitchen, where Dotty was bustling around on a range cooker, and delicious aromas were permeating the air, causing my stomach to rumble with hunger. "Oh, it smells so good in here," said my uncle. "What's on the menu, Dotty?" "Well, I decided to make macaroni and cheese, along with burger patties and tomato sauce, followed by lemon pudding with homemade vanilla ice cream. I wanted the children to taste our milk products and to see how creamy our produce really is." "My thoughts exactly," said my uncle, taking a glass jug of milk from the refrigerator and pouring some chocolate powder in it and sugar to taste. He poured us large glasses of creamy cold chocolate and handed one to me and one to Shane. "Taste that," he said, "and tell me what you think." "Oh, my word," I said, looking agog, as I glugged down the glass of chocolate milk, which left a moustache on my face. "This is the most delicious creamy milk I've ever tasted in my life. It's so different to what you get at the store." "I'm very glad you can see the difference," said my uncle, smiling with delight. He was clearly very proud of his dairy. Over the next couple of weeks, Shane and I had the most marvellous time at the dairy, and helped around doing all kinds of things, like giving the calves milk and assisting in the machine milking. My uncle gave us lessons on how to hand milk a cow, and it was quite an exhilarating experience for the both of us. Shane and I would enjoy interacting with the cows, who were curious and interested in us. I did encounter Sylvia,
who had a very high opinion of herself and knew that the feisty bull Inky could not keep his eyes off her, which had made her become rather conceited and very full of herself. I did try to make friends with Inky the bull, but he remained fractious, petulant and captious as ever, and he regarded my friendship as more of a challenge, almost as if I was like a red flag to him. So I decided not to expend any more energy or time on him, although I did express my disappointment to Shane that he was not more of a likeable fellow. "You're funny," said Shane. "Why would you want to be friends with a bull anyway?" "Well, let's face it, he is rather spectacular looking," I said. "If you say so," laughed Shane. In our spare time, Shane and I would ride the family quad bikes over the countryside, and it was great fun. We also enjoyed visiting the wood green and fishing at the stream in the heart of the woods, where we caught sturgeon, catfish and trout, as one thing I can say is we were both accomplished fishermen, as I'd learnt to fish in the muddy waters of the Hudson River at Piermont Point with the help of my father. Once I actually caught a dogfish shark that we had to throw back into the water, as they can't survive in fresh water for very long. One day Shane and I decided to take a quick shortcut through the field towards the wood green, as we wanted to scout for other fishing spots around the stream. I had completely forgotten my uncle's warning that Inky was sometimes put into the pasture there to graze. I think we'd overlooked the possibility that he might be there in the field. It hadn't even crossed our mind. So we ventured out into the field, talking happily together, when all of a sudden Inky came hurtling towards us at one hell of a speed, and he was charging us furiously like a bull in a ring, and was headed directly towards me, and was in one hell of a stroppy mood, and it would seem that I had become his red flag. In seconds I literally knew I was dead. No one can ever survive a charge like this from a bull. I began to sprint as fast as I possibly could from the rampaging bull. Both Shane and I were quite literally screaming at the top of our lungs, and the adrenaline was surging through our bodies at an alarming rate. I do not believe I have ever known fear like that before. It happened so quickly and so fast. All of a sudden, I just heard this very, very loud, sizable thump, like something monstrously huge being hurled onto the ground with a forceful thud. I glanced around and stopped running, for I couldn't believe what I was beholding. Standing there yards away from me was this incredibly Herculean, massive 10-foot-tall creature, who had quite literally saved our lives, for she had flung Inky to the ground so hard, in a commanding and potent force, so much so that his head had been torn apart from his body, and was now lying decapitated. The creature was female. She had small breasts, and looked so human, with the exception of the shape of her head and shoulders, that bore an uncanny, remarkable resemblance to the silverback gorilla. Her body was shaped like that of a bodybuilder, covered in long, flowing, golden-brown hair, with a very powerful upper torso that was dense with muscle, long, lean, overlong arms like a primate, and very powerful, lean legs. It was evident that she had come to our rescue to save us, for it had taken nothing for her to kill this bull, who was so much heavier than she was, for I would guess she was only 900 pounds, or even less, and she was 4 feet across the shoulder area, but she had a strength that was mind-blowing, and Shane had seen her pick up the bull in his arms before tossing him to the ground. The creature's face was so human, and the skin leathery and dark. She had a sloped forehead that was very, very furrowed, and looked at Shane and I with such a maternal expression that was so protective, nurturing and loving. It was like her deep-set eyes were saying to us, "Are the two of you going to be all right?" We watched in wondrous awe as this majestic, lofty and incredible creature pulled off 2 back legs from Inky, possibly to eat, as what was the point of wasting quality beef? She threw them over her shoulders and glided away with such a seamless grace. "Did you see that?" said Shane, looking agog. "That creature, whatever it was, she saved our lives." Moments later my uncle was out on the field. He had heard our screams, and he was so relieved to see that we were both alive, for he was certain we were dead, and was so out of breath it took him a while to calm down, because he was pretty much hyperventilating. "Oh,
I had the most terrible visions of having to tell your mother that Inky had killed you, he said. I never expected to find Inky dead. This is extraordinary. What the hell happened here? He said, studying Inky's body in astonishment. I'm sorry, Uncle Fitzgerald, I said. I forgot that Inky would be in the field. Don't be sorry, son. I'm just relieved you're not harmed, but I am very befuddled as to what has happened out here. How does a bull like this get torn to shreds like this? Shane and I tried to explain to my uncle exactly what had happened, and he was very surprised by what we were telling him. It is very strange that you say a creature that fit that description came to your rescue. For when your cousin was a young girl, she fell into our pond, and your aunt and I thought she was dead. We looked for her everywhere, and then we found her naked little body running towards us, telling us that she had fallen in, but a great big bear had rescued her. As you can imagine, we couldn't make sense of that, because bears aren't inclined to rescue little children. I thought that she was talking off her head, but that happened many years ago, and it seems to me that that same creature that rescued her rescued you today. It does make me feel like we have a very astute babysitter on our land, and I'm very grateful to the creature indeed for saving your lives. The following day my uncle took us to an auction where several bulls were going to be on show, and I asked my uncle if I could choose the bull that he would finally select to replace Inky. Very well, said my uncle, but only if he has a high genetic merit for a good milk yield. I went around the auction looking for the perfect bull, and then I saw one that stopped eating and was watching Shane and I intently, and when he saw us approaching his pen, he appeared very friendly and congenial towards us, which was such a change from Inky. Why is he so nice compared to the other bulls? I asked the farmhand. I mean, he's genuinely interested and curious in us. Well, it's a long story. His mother died in childbirth, and the farmer didn't think he would make it. But the farmer's daughter brought him into the house and fed it from a bottle, and it grew very attached to the people in the household, and the people loved it, and for a long time he thought he was a dog. Sadly, he grew too big for that home. You can see he's developed into a fine specimen of a bull, against all the odds. He's very affectionate and loves people. The family didn't want to sell him at all, but they've moved to Canada, and so they didn't have much choice in the matter. But he easily outrivals the bulls here on show today. I could see that the bull was studying us with friendly eyes, and without thinking I went over to stroke him, and he began rubbing his head against my hand affectionately, and I was rather smitten. Oh dear, said my uncle, approaching me with a big grin on his face. I assume this is the one you want me to buy. The only issue is whether he has a good genetic history for a quality milk yield. That's what concerns me. The farmhand overheard. Oh yes, he does, sir. Excellent, as it happens. To cut a long story short, we brought that bull back home, and my uncle told me that the bull was the very best bull that he has ever owned, and we called him Midnight Magic, as he followed us around the farm like a dog, and was always gentle, docile, and friendly. He put Sylvia in her place because he didn't languish all his attention on her. Midnight Magic was rather fond of all the cows in the herd, and was a proud father to generations of quality daughters that produced an abundance of milk, and he sired some of my uncle's very best cows. All these years later, I think of my time spent on my uncle's farm with the fondest and most cherished of memories. And now I know the creature we encountered that day that saved us from Inky was called Bigfoot, Sasquatch and Yeti. And for those of you that have children, if you have a Bigfoot babysitting them, let me assure you they are safer than they are with you. I know this to be the truth, for I saw with my very own eyes how protective that mother Bigfoot was over us. Of course, I'm sure that Bigfoots vary in their personalities like people, but if you have a good one on your property, you have a treasure, and you're very safe indeed. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, The land burst forth with whimsical mountainous valleys, spread out with lush carpets of emerald turf. And there were sculptural-looking ragged outcrops with prepossessing shapes that wouldn't have looked out of place in a museum of modern art. And then there were trees, so many of them, and far too many to count. Some isolated and standing alone, tall and proud like reserved strangers that did not desire to interact, whilst others clustered together in cheerful groups that were dotted around the countryside liberally. And then there was the lake, that glistened like a magical jewel in the noonday sun. And it was the shimmering silvery lake that had brought so many like myself before me to this writing retreat. The lake was bedazzling, surrounded by weeping willows with voluptuous shapely branches that cascaded over the rippling water with glorious green leaves that rather reminded me of a mermaid's hair. I drove my red Mazda down the rugged dirt driveway, experiencing the jolts and bumps that to a kid would have been like a joyful fairground ride. But for me, I felt as if I was growing a little queasy from the vibrations and impact of the jostling that had brought on a slight feeling of biliousness, which certainly reflected my age, as there was a time when a little jerking in the car would barely have bothered me at all. Soon I approached the symmetrical farmhouse with its bright red terracotta roof, rising up elegantly against the valley, like a vain, conceited, self-admiring woman who knew she looked rather spectacular and wasn't afraid to flaunt her assets, as despite her advancing age, it would seem that age was rather becoming on her, for the energies of those that had once resided within her white-painted, plastered walls was indelibly marked on every single brick in that home, rather like a permanent tattoo that simply can't be shifted. It added to the mystery and enchanting intrigue and allure of the home that was easily over 200 years old, and was solidly built and as strong as it was delicate, because its large arched windows and climbing roses over the front door softened the pretty facade, rather like lipstick on a woman's pale face. There was a woman in her early 40s, slim and slight, who looked as if she could have been blown over if the wind got a little frisky, came running towards my car to greet me. She was wearing tight-fitting blue jeans and a purple T-shirt, and she was quite attractive, with her bobbed golden-brown hair blowing against the soft breeze, and her hazel eyes twinkling with humour. I think I liked her already, because I was always drawn to easy-going women who knew how to laugh. A sense of humour was always very significant to me. "Hello there," she smiled, taking her long, slim hand in mine, and it felt as cold as ice, almost as if I was shaking hands with a ghost. "You must be Stephen," she said, smiling. "I'm so glad to finally meet you. I'm Juliet. You'll be glad to know that there are 3 other writers on this retreat with us," she said, helping me gather my suitcases from the back of my trunk. "I'm familiar with your work, but I will be honest with you, it's not really my kind of thing. Well, I prefer mystery novels. I'm very, very fond of fiction. I enjoy all the escapism, you see. The real world can somehow be brutally hard and sometimes rather cold and austere, and I'm certainly not into that." "Well, I'm an acquired taste," I teased. "I'm like an oyster. You either love my books or you hate them." "I may remind you that oysters have pearls," teased Juliet. "So I'm not surprised that you have some bestsellers over the years. Quite a few, I believe. Good for you. On the subject of oysters, though, they can grow on you. I used to hate them when I was a girl, but now I'm quite partial to them, with a touch of Tabasco sauce, a sprinkling of lemon juice, and copious amounts of black pepper." "Well, then there's hope for me yet," I piped. "Maybe my books will one day grow on you." It was at luncheon that I finally got to meet the 3 other writers, who were all well-known authors in their own right. One was a distinguished man called Turner, in his late 60s, with a very impressive full beard of grey hair, with weathered skin and piercing pale Arctic blue eyes that seemed to look directly through you, and as a result made me feel a little on edge. Then the other was a younger man in his early 30s called Brighton, who was tall, dark and well-built, and I imagine fell on the general stereotype guidelines
of what is considered aesthetically appealing to a woman, while the blonde woman with her fair eyelashes and green eyes was called Candy. I suppose she was attractive in a conventional sort of way, but as a writer I see beauty in a woman rather differently to most, and she wasn't my cup of tea, to put it mildly. Not to be unkind, of course. I'm really rather thrilled about being on this writing retreat again, Candy told me, while Juliet was bustling around in the kitchen busily preparing our lunch. I was here last year, and it made a monumental difference to the quality of my work. I turned out a bestseller as a result, and I haven't looked back since, so my publishers keep insisting that this writing retreat is a prerequisite for my work, because it seems to draw out my creativity, rather like blood out of a stone, she joked. Well, that is why I'm here too, I said. It was on the advice of my publisher, who wisely believes that hanging out with other authors helps one get rather inspired. Last year was a rough one for me. I suffered a severe bout of writer's block. There were times I thought I would never ever write again. As bad as that, said Candy. Now that is a bummer. I sincerely hope that never happens to me. I still need to pay my bills, and I have a dozen Persian cats to feed, and that doesn't come cheap, because those cats of mine demand the very best and turn their noses up to anything that's not catastrophically expensive. Going back to what the two of you were discussing a second ago, before the subject veered onto the dietary preferences of very discerning Persian cats with refined tastes, said Turner, who began twisting his beard in a ringlet. I believe writers getting together to brainstorm and discuss their ingenious ideas is, of course, a marvellous way of reigniting the inventive spark within us, for it helps significantly. And I think being in a beautiful environment like this, where you can meditate, take walks and ride horses across the countryside, also serves to activate the brain to become more resourceful and imaginative. I agree, said Brighton. Since when has a writer ever been able to turn out a great work of art, living in a concrete slab of a building, with no pretty views for enhancing expressiveness, ingenuity, and innovative ideas? Well, that's where I believe you're both wrong. It has indeed happened before, and has been an opportunity for many to daydream and fantasize about leaving the confines of a prison cell on the wings of one's imagination, to break the tedium of a long entrapment or incarceration. Look at the diary of Anne Frank. That was hardly written in ideal conditions. I think it was in a dark, oppressive attic, if I'm not right, where she was hiding from the Germans. Sometimes it can be horrifying, undemocratic, dictatorial conditions that can bring out the genius within us. But yes, I am inclined to agree that nature brings out the best in our work. Certainly with mine. Tell me, Brighton, I asked. I'm not familiar with your books. What sort of stuff do you write? Well, I'm into writing horror stories myself. Works of fiction, with, I hope, as clever twists as Stephen King. I'm hoping for some inspiration on this retreat. I'm thinking of taking some late-night walks in the darkness to bring out the quintessential fear factor for me. In my writing, of course, to set the horror scene for some of my novels. Well, I will suggest you take a torch with you, I joked. I wouldn't advise you stumbling around in the darkness in those woods. Now that would be horrifying. You could find yourself having a nasty accident. At the very least, you need to know where you're going. The lunch was incredibly pleasant and consisted of homemade vegetable soup, served with chunks of homemade bread, followed by chicken pie and salad, and then a tangy lemon souffle that rarely refreshed the palate. It truly was delicious. I was to learn over lunch, when Juliet was out of sight, that she had started this writing retreat to honour her deceased husband, who had been an aspiring author and who hadn't achieved the notoriety he had desired and deserved. But it wasn't without trying, for his work had been turned down and rejected by numerous publishers who had failed to discern the value, quality and research of his work. "It's a really sad story," said Candy, lowering her voice into a soft whisper. "I really feel for poor Juliet. I really do. I can't imagine what that poor woman has been through. Imagine discovering your husband lying dead there in the lake and not knowing what on earth has happened to him. I couldn't imagine what she must be feeling." "How terrible," I said. "I had no idea that Juliet had lost her husband in such a despicable, awful way. But surely the coroner had some idea how he must have died. There must have been an autopsy done," I asked. "No, it genuinely looked like he'd drowned, which is very odd and bizarre because he was a swimming champion of note. So how does that happen? He was a very strong man. I gather there were 3 large scratches on his left cheek that looked like a cat scratching him. So it left the coroner befuddled and confounded, with more questions than answers. Before long I settled into the writing retreat effortlessly easily, and I made sure to incorporate some light exercise in my daily regime. I also took care not to overeat or to drink too much wine, as my purpose here was to write, and nothing would be able to flow if I was plastered, although the temptation to overindulge was definitely there, especially since the wine was excellent and the food very good. It really was helping me talking to the other writers, as I was finding new ideas for my book had suddenly surfaced, thanks to the broad range of topics that were discussed over the table at night, and it can take a fleeting comment that can inspire a whole new novel for me. "I'm going out tonight for a bit of writing inspiration," said Brighton. "It'll help set the mood and tone for my story I intend to write. And besides, it's a full moon. Does anybody fancy coming with me? I could do with the company. I'm not that fond of being in the dark." I noticed his dark brown eyes landed on me. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "I'm not sure it's my sort of thing, hanging around in the woods at the dead of night. Besides, I could do with my beauty sleep," I joked. "Go on," said Brighton. "Be a sport. Surely you could have a little excitement added to your books by engaging your readers with an element of fear that only the ambience of a dark, creepy night could engender. I'm sure your readers would appreciate it. It's good to keep them guessing and not to be predictive in your writing." "Very well," I said. "Why not? What harm can it possibly do?" "Good. That's settled then," said Brighton, looking as pleased as Punch. "I'll be waking you up at 2 in the morning. You better not be difficult to wake up." Isn't it one of life's biggest ironies that I was having the best night's sleep I've had in a long time, and I was engaged and engrossed in a fabulous dream where I was flying on the back of an eagle, when suddenly I was jolted wide awake and dragged away from my fantastical magical world back to our boring reality within seconds. I felt rather annoyed. "It's time to go, sleepyhead," said Brighton. "Are you ready to get up? It's already 2 o'clock in the morning. We're running a little late." I grumbled and moaned, complaining bitterly like a cantankerous, grumpy old man. I felt aggrieved that I'd agreed to this preposterous suggestion to get out of bed in the dead of night, just to get spooked. What was I even thinking? I mean, I wasn't a horror novelist, for goodness sake, and even if I was, I doubt I would be taking late-night treks in the forest just to get creeped out. And so it was, with a comportment and flavour of great reluctance and disinclination, I rose warily from my bed, with about as much enthusiasm as a domestic tabby that's suddenly forced to leave the confines of his cosy, warm sleeping spot. My energy levels on this icy morning were as slow-moving and stagnant as that of a sloth. But in a dazed, sluggish state, I hesitantly threw on some warm clothes and crept down the creaking antique staircase that squeaked under the weight of my rubber walking boots. Then I ambled quickly towards the entrance and the large front door, where Brighton was waiting for me, with a deep scowl on his face. He looked far from pleased. "My word," he said, "you know how to take your time and to keep a man waiting. You're like an old woman dawdling around the powder room. Now that's a little nasty. There's no need to be so sarcastic," I piped. "I'm here, am I not?" We were greeted by the friendly cold blasts of freezing air that pummelled us hard, and I just wanted to run back to the snug, reassuring comfort of my warm bed. But I thought better of it, because I could see the steely determination on Brighton's face, and I didn't have the heart to let him down. It was fortunate that the glistening round shape of the full moon and the silvery stars, along with the light from our headlamps, made the dusky darkness seem more mellow and inviting. The walk was pleasant and even rather invigorating, and with every step my body became warmer, and before long we passed the lake, and then we took a sharp turn towards the left that led directly towards the Sylvan, which we accessed through a small field of sagebrush. I could see the tall triangular silhouettes of the ponderosa pines, spruce and Douglas fir trees, their green bounty now blackened by the darkness of the night. I was relieved to find the open hiking trails made our walk less arduous, even though it was still not easy, and you could lose your footing on some of the sharp, precipitous inclines, which were arranged with rather loose rocks amidst the fern-covered forest floor. A gentle soft wind whistled through the trees that began to sway like dancing ladies, and the leaves on the forest floor rustled. I had to admit it was a beautiful, blissful night, with a cool breeze blowing gently against my face, while the chirping sounds of the crickets and the frogs serenaded us in a reassuring, peaceful and tranquil ambience, and in the distance the wailing sounds of a lone wolf or coyote could be heard, which for me was oddly comforting, in a strange sort of way. All of a sudden it was as if someone had turned off a light switch, almost as if the music of the forest suddenly muted, and even the rustling leaves became inaudible, as did the still breeze that stopped, and the dancing ladies became deadly still, as though locked in an insidious deep trance. The hushed, noiseless forest was so oppressively silent, and it enveloped me with an uneasy cloak of precarious uncertainty. It was almost as if the portals to another world had opened and unrolled their iniquitous dark carpets out to welcome the demonic celebrities of the night into this dingy, gloomy world. I noted that even the sweet, refreshing scent of the pine had been suppressed by these sulphurous rank compounds and odorous notes that rather reminded me of a skunk that had been rolling around in a rubbish heap, saturated by pools of its own urine. It was hideously repulsive. "I'm not feeling good," I whispered to Brighton. "Look at me. I'm shaking so much. Something's not right about this forest. I don't know what it is, but I feel rather uneasy. It's hauntingly airy in here, and it feels like we're not alone." "It does feel peculiar," admitted Brighton. "But that's why we're here in the first place, to gather these experiences, like leaves on the forest floor, to describe the creepiness of the forest at night. It's important to get a feel for being out on a night like this. I need to meditate on these feelings, to describe them eloquently in my novels." "It doesn't get more spine-chilling than this," I whispered. "I'm being serious, Brighton. Something's not right. I feel it in my gut," I said, rubbing my stomach awkwardly. "And that hideous, nauseous smell, it's making me want to hurl up the contents of my stomach, and it's getting stronger and more powerful every second." "You're not chickening out on me tonight," said Brighton. "I chose you as my partner because you looked as if you'd got more steel in your guts than the others. So don't let me down." "What's that noise? Did you hear it?" I said, looking at Brighton with startled eyes that grew as round as saucers. "Did you hear that? I think something is coming, and whatever it is, it's very big." All of a sudden we heard a crashing, banging and thumping sound,
as if something massively large, like a huge elephant or rhino, was thundering through the forest at an alarming speed. And to make things so much worse, I could hear loud snorts and grunts. I do not know why I stood there, why I failed to run, and I still ponder about this to this very day. But the next thing I knew that was moving through the dark shadows was a giant creature that towered at 10 feet tall, with gargantuan, monstrous shoulders that were at least 3.5 feet across, possibly even 4. And this thing was darker than the darkest night, and was covered from head to toe with long, flowing black hair. You could be forgiven for believing that the portal to hell itself had suddenly opened, and the devil's helper had been unleashed into our reality. I was transfixed by feelings of total horror as I gawked in astonishment at this monstrous, outlandish creature. But what was it? I couldn't imagine. It was built like a man, but it wasn't a man. It possessed features reminiscent of an ape, but it wasn't an ape either. But the details of its dark face were obscured by the darkness, yet the blazing red malevolent eyes burned into mine, searing me like hot fiery coals. How I longed for the ground to swallow me up. I wanted to be anywhere else in the entire world but here. I cannot describe the terror that infiltrated every area of my being, with an overwhelming sense of impending dread. I felt exactly like a prisoner on death row, being strapped to a gurney, ready to await my ultimate fate and execution. For the spirit of death was looming over me, like a dark, shadowy cloud, eager to escort me into the next world. My legs trembled beneath me. My hair stood on edge. But I was incapacitated by fear, so much so that I was a sitting duck and target for this predator, an easy meal, an offering. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I run away? This demonical creature curled back its thin lips to expose its jagged human-like teeth, where its broken edges had naturally formed and sharpened into nasty points. There was a low, guttural, growling sound emanating from the back of the creature's throat that reverberated through the woods, causing the ground to vibrate, rattle and shake. And then his flat nostrils flared out, and he began to snarl. In any second he would pounce on me. I instinctively knew I was the prey, and he was the predator. "Run! Run! Run!" the voice inside me screamed. "Run, or this creature will eat you!" But I was frozen to the spot, weighed down by the invisible gargantuan weight of an invasive, paralyzing fear that pinned me down to the ground with a powerful brute force, almost as if I was trapped under a 1,000-pound tree trunk and could not move a single muscle. All of a sudden, the creature's attention and blazing red eyes were diverted from me to the frantic and desperate sounds of a frenzied Brighton who was trying to escape from this devil's lair. But he was struggling to abscond and flee, and his clumsy, lumbering efforts resulted in him tripping over himself in an uncoordinated, cloddish manner. He let out a couple of agonizing yelps that sounded exactly like a dog in pain, and I guessed he must have sprained his ankle, because he began hobbling away with one leg unnaturally straight, looking over his shoulder with a look of absolute terror on his face. I could discern his heavy breathing as he ran through the sagebrush towards the lake, and the creature was now hot on his trail, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Help me! Help me! Someone help!" It seemed like this predator was so much more interested in chasing after his prey than having it delivered to him on a plate, so it would seem that he'd lost interest in me and found running after the terrified man infinitely more preferable as a challenge. Like an ice statue at a glorious dinner banquet, my body began to loosen from its tight, frozen trap. I was able to break free from the confines of my body that had held me captive and prisoner. I ran nimbly through the edge of the sagebrush, past the lake towards the house,
as fast as I possibly could. And I've never run like that before, and I know I never shall again. I bolted through the front door as quickly as I could. I was completely out of breath, and sweat was pouring down my face, and my shirt was saturated with water, and I remember, even though it was a cold night, I could have wrung out my shirt, for it was that saturated. I hightailed it to the rifle cabinet in the hallway that I'd noticed earlier on in the day. It was locked, but with the back of an umbrella, I hastily smashed the glass open and grabbed a high-caliber rifle and some bullets, and off I went, running towards the lake. I could see the large creature in the water, bending over something and holding it down with one powerful hand. I began to unload my rifle directly into the creature, and I hit him in the chest several times. He let out the most ear-piercing, agonized scream that you've ever heard, and ran into the forest, but I was pretty sure he would die, for those injuries were lethal. All of a sudden a drenched figure came bolting from the lake towards me, and I realized that it was Brighton. I've never seen anyone shake or wobble as much as he did in those moments. I began to rip off his sopping clothes for him, and grabbed him some of my dry clothes to wear, which he put on gratefully, although being so tall, my pants looked like long shorts on his legs. I honestly do not know how he managed to dress, because I've never seen anyone shudder as much as he did right then. "You saved me, bro," said Brighton, suddenly giving me a huge hug. "What happened?" I asked. "Well, the critter was running after me. He was ever so fast. I've never seen anything like that before. I knew he was going to get me. I jumped into the lake. It was my only choice, and swam away, hoping to remain hidden under a couple of fallen logs there. But this thing found me, and he tried to drown me. I was fighting to hold my breath, and then you fired, and the creature let go of his hold on me. There was blood everywhere in the water after you shot him. I think he's bleeding out somewhere. There's no way he could survive those shots." "What is going on in here? And what's this racket all about?" said Juliet, entering the kitchen, with a bemused, rather disgruntled expression on her face. She was wearing her fluffy green dressing gown, and her brown hair stood on edge in rather endearing spikes that reminded me of a hedgehog. "Do you realise what time it is? It's 4 o'clock in the morning. You two should be ashamed of yourself. You're paying guests in my home, and you've been incredibly inconsiderate and very rude. You could have woken up the whole household by now. I've been trying to get to sleep, but no, you've been making a huge commotion in here. I've been hearing frantic screams, and gunshots, actually. Oh my goodness," she said, seeing the rifle lying next to the kitchen counter. "Who's been using my rifle? What the heck is going on here?" We proceeded to tell Juliet all about the events of our night, and her eyes grew as round as saucers, and she was visibly disturbed. This thing that you say you saw," she said quietly, looking directly at Brighton for answers. "You say it tried to drown you. Is that right?" "Well, it was chasing after me, and it was as fast as a cheetah. I've never seen anything that could run that quickly. I decided to jump in the lake, as I thought it was my only chance of escape. But this creature, it was clever. It saw me hiding under a log. It seized me, plunging my head under the water and holding me down in one powerful grasp. I think it has excellent night vision, which might explain the red eye shine it exudes. And, boy, it's built like a brick shithouse. There's no other way to describe him. He was massive, this thing, well yoked out. So much brawn and muscular strength, like none I've seen before. I've never seen a creature like this. I think what transpired tonight is exactly what might have happened to my husband," said Juliet. "It makes perfect sense now. The pieces just seem to fit. I think my husband may have encountered the same creature you did. And like you, my husband decided to plunge into the water to aid his escape, because he was a powerful swimmer, let me tell you that. But it seems this creature was far stronger than him and drowned him."
I must admit I interceded. Don't you think it was a peculiar way for the creature to try and kill you? Drowning you, I mean, I said to Brighton. I mean, he was so powerful. All he needed to do was to thump you on the head, and it would have been lights out for you. Never mind all that, said Juliet, grabbing the rifle. The main thing is that you're both alive. I need to make absolutely sure that the monster is dead, because I can't have something hanging around like that when I have paying guests on this property, and I don't need anyone else found drowned in the lake by this thing. I'm coming with you, I said, grabbing another rifle from her father's vandalised gun cabinet.
It was still dim and dingy outside, with a very macabre atmosphere that continued to send nasty chills down my spine. We courageously ventured towards the wood, with nerves of steel, cautiously and uneasily. Sure enough, as we had anticipated, lying deceased, with life extinct under the ponderosa pine tree, was a monumental, bulging lump of matted hair that looked like a whale based on its Herculean proportions. We inspected the creature curiously, examining it with a keen interest, for it isn't every day that you encounter a grotesque beast like this, with a barrel chest that was congealed with blood, and some of the creature's innards had burst through the chest cavity. The creature was solidly built like an army tank, aligned with powerful muscle definition, and I believe it could have easily weighed over 900 pounds. It certainly stank to high heaven, of that skunk-like sulphurous odour that we had discerned before the forest morphed from a tranquil sanctuary into a colourless, antagonistic atmosphere, devoid of any light. In some way the body rather reminded me of a bear's, only humanoid in its shape, and much more brawny and muscular. It was also hairless on the face, palms, and on the hands and soles of the feet, and possessed very long arms, much like that of a primate. It also boasted the quintessential typical pyramid-shaped head often seen in the ape species, but the face of this creature was most certainly like that of a man, with a beard and moustache and long hair on the back of its scalp that hung to below the shoulders. Juliet and I decided that we would return at first light when the sun came out to take quality photographs of the strange creature, but later in the morning, when we did come back to the spot, the body had mysteriously vanished, but in place of where the body lay dead was the most beautiful yellow opal, which is in fact a lucky stone that represents happiness. It was strange to uncover such a beautiful jewel in replacement for the dead body, which for us was a curious conundrum of which we could make no sense. To cut a long story short, I was to find out later from Juliet on another writing retreat at her home that she had discovered that the creature we had encountered was called Bigfoot. I gather a psychic who visited her home told her that the opal was a gift from relatives of the deceased Bigfoot as a way of atonement for what their family member had done to her husband and had attempted to do to Brighton. It would seem that the incomprehensible, problematic and inscrutable Bigfoot had indeed caused a great deal of distress among his own kind, and caused the death of multiple other Bigfoots, as she could sense he was a convoluted bully who was mentally paradoxical and enigmatic, and had been wilfully cast out and estranged by his own family, who saw him as a liability. So much like a rogue lion, he lived on his own, which I imagined increased his rising level of rage, bitterness and hatred towards man and beast. As far as Brighton was concerned, he ended up writing some bestseller horror stories, and has no regrets about his encounter with a Bigfoot, even though he came so close to losing his life that day. He told me the experience had heightened his sensitivity and his creative ability to take the terror right into his novels to a brand new level, because he knew what it was like to be stalked in the forest in the middle of the night by a demonical predatory creature. That is an invaluable experience, I can assure you, for any creative writer. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it wasn't an easy job, as I began stripping back the old Victorian wallpaper with my large scraper, and it curled back like long strips of skin, and fell past my ladder to the ground below, rather reminding me of a pleasurable sun-kissed summer holiday with my husband and I that we'd enjoyed together by the seaside, where he burnt so badly from overexposure to the sun
as his fair skin meant his sun tolerance was very low. I remember I had peeled back the skin on his body, and it was so thin and translucent when you lifted it up to the light. It was quite fascinating, really, and oddly satisfying for me. I seemed to be getting the same kind of warped pleasure out of pulling back the old wallpaper with its oppressive deep burgundy design. I'd always thoroughly enjoyed popping pimples as a teenager and squeezing blackheads, and my sister complained that a small scar on her lower chin was a result of me brutally attacking one of her pimples with such a determined zealousness and enthusiasm that I'd left an indelible mark on her for life. She wasn't adverse to showing her friends what I had done viciously to her skin, and that included every single visitor that frequented our home. Growing up, all her friends gave me a wide, wary girth, as if they suspiciously suspected that I was going to chase them down, pounce on them, and perform mass blackhead extractions on them. My husband and I had recently bought this enchanting, magnificent farmhouse in the heart of the idyllic Kentucky countryside. It was called the Owl's Nest, but sadly it was so incredibly dated, stuck in a time warp. It looked like the previous owner simply loved everything Victorian. I would have understood it if the house was an old Victorian home, as then the decor would align perfectly and be complementary to the architecture of the house. Our farmhouse was possibly built in the 1980s and was more modern than it was historic. It was charming, though, with a magical, whimsical character all of its own, and a very beguiling allure that was hard to resist. In my opinion, houses are very much like people, with different personalities. You either like them, hate them, or remain dispassionate and indifferent towards them. On this particular day, as we drove through the large wooden gate, signposted the Owl's Nest, and drove down the windy white gravel driveway that hugged the rough ground beneath her, as if in some way they were entwined together like the roots of a tree, driving towards the house. I had fallen in love, as I could feel the quickening of my pulse and the butterflies in my stomach that sent waves of electricity darting over my body in blissful, euphoric shooting spasms. I fancied that I had to have this house, come hell or high water, even if it meant chaining myself to the front door and simply refusing to shift. I'm not sure why, but the house took my breath away. She stood there elegantly, in the middle of a sumptuous emerald green valley, looking like a bedazzling woman with a warm, welcoming and congenial bright smile that seemed impossible to erase. I could sense whether rain, sun, hail or snow, the house would portray that joyful, uplifting and airy energy. I do remember it had been a particularly pretty spring morning, and the shafts of sunlight had enveloped her crisp white walls in an ethereal light, making her look like a glistening pearl, and some of her bright white walls glittered with a golden glaze that gave them a luminescent lustre. It would seem that the simple, symmetrical box-shaped white-painted brick farmhouse with its green slate roof, along with a perfect row of pale green framed windows and matching shutters, had simply won over my heart. Then there was a sweeping white painted wooden deck that followed the contours of the house seamlessly, providing substantial areas for al fresco dining and entertainment, overlooking exquisite panoramic views. And those views, don't let me get started about them. Our house was quite literally framed by acres and acres of undulating verdant countryside, pretty flowery meadows, red barns, stables, outbuildings, and everything was in reasonably good condition. The creme de la creme for me was a pretty sanctuary, a delightful private oasis, secret garden, a hideaway, or room if you like, of its own, all that was home to a glistening silvery pond, fringed by curvaceous sweeping willows that surrounded it like sizable voluptuous women from a Renaissance painting. Its sparkling silvery surface was covered in water lilies that seemed to float like pink stars. Then, to the rear of the pond, was a grove of trees that stretched back for many miles, consisting of statuesque red maples, oaks, and spruce trees. I still remember us pulling into the carport and parking our white Honda Accord. My husband shut down the engine, glancing over at me with a rather bewildered expression upon his face. "Are you all right, Emma?
You haven't said a word since we drove down the driveway. Don't you like the look of the farmhouse? I thought it would be right up your alley. Did I get it horribly wrong?" he asked me, looking very befuddled. "I was so sure this was the sort of farmhouse you were looking for." I looked at him with dewy eyes. "I'm too stunned to speak," I said. "I think I've fallen in love." "Sorry, sweetheart," I teased. "You've got serious competition. This house is drop-dead gorgeous." We could see the businesslike, rather barrel-shaped estate agent wearing a rather tight navy blue suit that made her look like a sausage bursting out of the seams. She was hurrying out of the black front door, her body bouncing up and down as she jiggled towards us. She was determined. Her resolute beady eyes revealed an impatient eagerness that she failed to disguise. I could perceive by her determined, hungry expression that her mind was racing through the sales techniques she intended to use on us, and her ambitions were so blazingly obvious that she had about as much subtlety as a rhinoceros. This woman could see her next big fat commission check smiling down at her already. I nudged my husband quickly. "Donovan," I said, "I have to have this house. Please put an offer in right now." "We haven't got any time to lose," I said, as I started to visualize hundreds of people determined to buy this house, and that just couldn't happen. "Donovan," I said, "I'm begging you, don't play games by reducing the price on this property. Give the sellers exactly what they're asking for. Then we'll settle. This is a house you can't negotiate over. Trust me on this. All too often, if you play hardball, you end up losing the very house you want. We can't lose this house," I said. "We just can't." "But, sweetheart," he had protested, "don't you think you should look inside the property first, before you make such a rash decision like this?" "I want it," I protested. "I don't need to see the insides. I've made up my mind. You need to put the offer in right now." I said this in a very demanding tone. I was never normally this pushy or insistent, and have usually been accused of being too easygoing and laid back. So my husband knew that I meant business. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. DuPont. So good to meet you both," said the estate agent, shaking our hands firmly. "Now I need to warn you, the house inside is a little dated. The previous owner was rather besotted by the Victorian era and—" "We want the house," said my husband. "Could you put an offer in to the owner right now? We will be offering the asking price. I appreciate it." "But Mr. DuPont," said the estate agent, looking at my husband with an astonished look on her face, "you haven't seen the inside of the house yet. It might need a little work on it, and the decor is very dated. You've not seen the outbuildings or the stables yet. Should you not check them first?" "That won't be necessary," said my husband. "We want the Owl's Nest property, and that is that." I remember the estate agent beginning to giggle and say, "Mr. DuPont, how I wish all my buyers were like you. Then my job would be an absolute buzz." Of course, the inside of the house required work, a lot of work, but that was where I arose to the occasion, with my illustrious background in interior design, and an excellent pair of inspirational, savvy hands that were fast and efficient, with a natural artistic creativity. I had years of experience behind me in helping people turn a sow's ear of a home into a silk purse. The interior of our delightful farmhouse was very open plan, but a few pivotal adjustments needed to be made here and there, nips and tucks if you like a seamstress would apply to a dress, which is what I invariably did to the house, and it was beginning to look quite sensational, even if I say so myself. I could hear the sound of a car sweeping up our white gravel driveway as the wheels scrunched the pebbles. I thought it might be the postman in his van throwing some letters through our letterbox, but he was usually quite noisy. I waited to hear the thump of the post hitting the floor, but it was a long time coming. Instead, I heard a car door slam and reluctant footsteps approach our front door, almost as if the stranger wasn't sure whether to cross our threshold or not. I could hear 3 knocks. Oh no, I thought. I didn't want to answer the door wearing dungarees with pieces of wallpaper scattered over me like dandruff. Worse still, my hair looked like I'd been dragged through a hedge backwards, and I'd lost sight of my hairbrush. I heard the knock again, and so I ventured down the stairs towards the door. A young girl with long blonde hair and fair skin was standing there. At a guess I would have put her at being about 16 years old. I think she looked heartily relieved to see me, as I was so dishevelled I would have made a self-conscious porcupine feel relaxed.
"Hello," I said, looking at the young girl rather awkwardly. "Would you like to come in? I could rustle you up a cup of coffee if you like. But please excuse my appearance. I know I look dreadful, but I'm in the middle of redecorating. I look as if I'm completely covered with dandruff."
"You look fine," said the girl, with a glint in her eyes. "A coffee would be very nice," she said. "I'm Emma, by the way," I said. "Oh, and I'm Jolene," she said. "Very pleased to finally meet you." I beckoned for the young girl to take a seat, while I proceeded to boil the kettle. "I used to live here at the Owl's Nest, you know, with the previous owners of this house. They are my foster parents." "Oh, that's fascinating," I said. "So you used to live here?" "That's right," she said, pursing her lips rather awkwardly. "If Mrs. Ward, my foster mother, even knew I was here, she'd probably have a cadenza on the spot. But I knew I needed to warn you. I couldn't live with myself otherwise if I didn't do that. And that would not be fair to you either." A cold shudder went over my body like an icy wind, and my heart sank like the sun slipping behind the horizon and dipping in the valley. I didn't want to hear what Jolene had to say. I was living the perfect dream, and wasn't desirous for that dream to be shattered by bad news into a million shards like a broken mirror. What was she going to tell me, I wondered, holding my breath ever so tightly in my chest. I daren't breathe, not yet anyway, until it was safe to do so. What on earth was she going to reveal to me? Part of me was eager to erect barricades and high fences over my ears, to cut off the entry points of the toxic words that, like poisonous chemicals, could erode my joy in an instant, or like a thief in the night, rob me of my greatest material treasure, this quintessential home of mine. Was our house haunted, I wondered in horror? Or perhaps located near an Indian burial ground? Please, no. I couldn't abide that. Not when all my hopes about our future were pinned to the very foundations of a farmhouse I was eager to call our forever home. "Well," said Jolene gingerly, her fingers trembling as she sipped the coffee from her mug, "our family was having some problems with Bigfoot activity on the land, which was why we sold the Owl's Nest in the first place. It was all desperately sad and unfortunate. I thought you should know. We were sworn to secrecy by Mrs. Ward and her husband, as they were petrified that this farmhouse would not sell if the new owners found out about the potential Bigfoot problem, so everything was hushed and covered up." I was astonished. "Is this some kind of a wind-up?" I asked, "because it's not even remotely funny. Are you kidding?" "Don't be ridiculous. There's no such creature as Bigfoot. Isn't he all part of spurious pulp fiction and urban legend?" "It's not pulp fiction," said the girl. "Hands on heart. Bigfoot is real. I know, because I've seen them myself and played with the youngsters. I think it's the tall, gawky twin thumper who's responsible for Hugh's death. I'd actually put money on it. I believe it was just a terrible accident, if that makes you feel any better. I know he didn't kill Hugh intentionally, but he seems to be blindly oblivious of his own strength and gets quite heavy-handed with stuff. He doesn't mean any harm by it, but he's rather rambunctious, mischievous and untamed. Rather like a bull in a china shop, I suppose." "You're talking way ahead of me, Jolene," I said apologetically. "Who is Hugh? What happened to him? And who are the twins? And how many Bigfoots are on our land? Could we start there?" "Well, I think there are about 8 Bigfoots," said Jolene, "although I can't be sure about that. But I do think it's an extended family. But the adults, you don't have to worry about them at all. They're very benevolent, benign and evasive. It's a tall juvenile twin thumper. He's the one you need to worry about.
He's your problem. As I said, he means no harm, but he's impulsive and very headstrong. I tell you what, supposing I believe that everything you're saying is true, just hypothetically, why don't you start from the very beginning? Like when you discovered that there were Bigfoots here at the Owl's Nest, I asked. The very beginning of your story. Well, the Bigfoots aren't always here, admitted Jolene. They come and go like gypsies. I think they're travellers, but as long as the Wards have lived on this land, they've seen them from time to time, gathering apples from the orchard or picking wild berries from the briars. At first we thought they were black bears, but then we soon realised that the creatures were Bigfoots. They had human-like faces. They were intimidating, very scary, like apex predators, but in our experience they genuinely don't like to be seen. But when we had encountered them, they have been harmless, congenial and benign, and have always glided back into the woods. They've never been a threat to us, nor have they caused us any problems, so we've left them well alone. We've often heard chattering in the woods, and that's them talking together. They speak very fast in a strange, rather peculiar language, using lots of clicks. When they're really happy, they whoop or whistle, and their calls can be heard from miles around. If they're upset, they scream, and that is a blood-curdling sound that you really don't want to hear. It makes your skin crawl. Well, it does mine. It sounds so terrifying. If you ever hear that sound sounds like a woman is being murdered, it's not a woman being murdered. It's probably a large male throwing a hissy fit and having an explosive tantrum that they want everyone to know about. The female Bigfoot are far less temperamental, more grounded, circumspect and pragmatic, and they usually rule the roost in the family, unless you have a belligerent male in charge who uses his size to intimidate the females. One of the Bigfoot mothers gave birth to 2 twin boys a while back, and they almost look identical, except one is significantly taller than the other. That's the one you need to watch. When they were big enough, they started to interact with Hugh and I, and they were great fun to play with. It's the tall, lumbering one, as I keep saying, the ungainly twin, who's a clumsy oaf with very bad hand-to-eye coordination. He's prone to getting into all kinds of scrapes and trouble. He's so ham-handed and accident-prone, which is not what you'd expect to find in a Bigfoot. They're usually very acrobatic, agile, graceful, and remarkably intelligent, but not Thumper. I don't know what it is, but he's not 100% right in the head. We enjoyed playing with the twin Bigfoots because they were comical and very funny. Well, at least the smaller one was, as he was sensitive, clever, intelligent, and just lovely to be around. We called him Acorn. Before long you forgot that they were both covered in hair, as it's pretty much like playing with any other regular kids. But their strength does set them apart from us. We played all kinds of games like ball, tag, hide-and-seek and marbles, and one day we were swimming in the creek together, splashing around for fun, and the tall, ponderous twin lunged towards me, pushing me under the water so forcefully, just as a practical joke. I nearly drowned. I was fighting with all my worth to get back to the surface. I truly thought I was going to die, until Acorn intervened and rescued me, giving Thumper a huge telling off. I got the impression that Thumper had no comprehension of his own strength. It had all been just a game to him. I was always wary of him after that, and he would thump me so hard on my back, very happily when he saw me, with his overlong arm, failing to realise that it really hurt, while his brother would just tap us gently. I think Thumper was really rather dim, because he never ever learnt from his mistakes. Acorn kept apologising to us all the time for Thumper's clod-hopping clumsiness, through his body language and facial expressions, indicating to us that his brother was rather handicapped, or backwards if you like. In his language he told us that Thumper was kabook, which I think means idiot in their speech. I find it rather easy to understand the Bigfoots, for they are quite human and very good at expressing themselves, even with the language barrier between us. But they certainly knew how to pronounce our names, and the names we'd given them. One day as we were playing with stones and aiming them at the different cedar trees to see who was the best shot, unbeknown to us, the twins' mother was secretly watching us from behind a tree. She was quite inquisitive about her younglings' human playmates. I never noticed her, as she hides in plain sight without you even being aware that she's there. The Bigfoots are masterful at becoming one with their environment, just like chameleons. So word of advice, never ever play hide-and-seek with a Bigfoot, as you'll always lose, because you'll never find them. Well, Thumper threw a large stone at the tree where she was hiding as he'd seen her. It was his idea of a joke, but his stone missed the tree and hit her very hard in the head. His mother wasn't amused. She let out a huge painful yelp and came gliding towards Thumper, chattering angrily at him, while he hung his head in shame, for he knew what he'd done. She grabbed him with her overlong arms, shook him for a second, which was possibly like a slap on the wrist to them. She was so mad with him that she completely forgot that we were there. The trouble is that Thumper began to love throwing stones. It became his favourite pastime, although his mother had forbidden him from throwing stones again because he was such a klutz. But he never listened to her reprimands because he was delinquent, wayward, and deliberately naughty. So I said, "How did your foster brother die then?" "Well, he was riding his bicycle ahead of me in the woods down one of the bicycle trails, and a stone was thrown at him. I think it was Thumper. He fell off his bicycle and went rolling down the rocky embankment, with his bicycle toppling over the top of him, and his head hit the rocks with a thunderous crack, and it was all over for him. He was dead on the spot. It was quite dreadful, but so quick, I'm glad to say he didn't suffer. Of course, we were completely devastated, and Mrs. Ward, well, she was very upset, of course. She loved Hugh. Well, we all did. Anyway, after Hugh had fallen down the embankment, all of a sudden the female Bigfoot came gliding towards him, and when she saw him lying there dead, she picked him up from the ground and carried him to the flat earth, and then she began to lament, wail, and scream. She beat her chest with her fists. She was terribly distraught, more than I even was. I saw her shaking the tall twin, Thumper, very hard, and showing him the stone as if to say, "Look what you've done." It was very distressing, and both Acorn and Thumper were very upset. I believe the poor Bigfoot mother blamed herself for Thumper's juvenile antics, but it really was an accident. I felt sorry for her. She was so upset. "So you told your foster mother what had happened?" "Of course I did," said Jolene. "But she told me to keep my mouth tightly shut and not to breathe a single word about it to anyone. Hugh's death was obviously ruled an accident by the coroner, and it really was, but indirectly the butter-fingered Thumper was wholly responsible." "So you think I'm in danger?" I asked Jolene. "From Thumper? Is that what you're trying to say?" "Well, yes. I did come to warn you directly about him. I think he's slightly retarded, and if you were to go in the woods he could potentially strike you with a rock, and that is very dangerous because to him it's a game. His mother won't let Thumper play with rocks any more, but he's so mischievous and inclined to be very disobedient, and that's what bothers me. After the incident, the twins were not allowed to play with me because of what had happened to Hugh, and I really miss them." "I don't need to worry about the other Bigfoots, do I?" asked Jolene. "No, not at all. They will scare you because they look frightening and very intimidating, of course, but they won't cause you any problems. Well, they shouldn't. They never have to us." After Jolene had left my home, I meditated on what she'd told me for many long days, like a sponge soaking up the water very slowly. It was very difficult to assimilate this information, which I chose initially not to share with my husband. I knew in my gut that it had taken Jolene an enormous amount of courage to tell me all this, so unless she was completely deranged, then her story was likely to be true. I was reluctant to visit the wooded area on our land in case that juvenile Bigfoot Thumper was around and was playing with rocks. If these Bigfoots, well, the large ones, were harmless, I hoped with all my heart that after Hugh's tragic death that the female mother had managed to reveal to Thumper that throwing large stones for fun could result in lethal, devastating consequences. Then, of course, there was the distinct possibility that Thumper might grow out of his juvenile antics. I sincerely hoped so. It was reassuring that the large Bigfoots did not present a problem, but if they were scary and intimidating, then I'd better warn Donovan about them, I thought. It was over dinner one night that I told Donovan that I'd heard we'd had Bigfoots on our property before, who weren't aggressive, but one youngling was inclined to be rather mischievous and appeared to throw stones a lot. My husband began to hoot with laughter, waving his finger at me, saying, "You have a great sense of humour, Emma. You nearly had me hooked. That was a good one." From thenceforth I decided that I'd said more than enough, and that if my husband stumbled across a Bigfoot, he probably wouldn't have a coronary on the spot, because a part of him would be prepared for an erroneous sighting. One day he returned from shopping in the local town. I think he'd picked up some pool supplies for our swimming pool. I noticed he was acting rather strangely. His eyes were so round, and he began to shake as he poured himself a gin and tonic. I'd never seen him behave like that before. "What's got into you?" I asked him. He looked at me with wide, earnest eyes. "I think I saw a Bigfoot," he told me. "Where?" I asked him. "She was about 8 foot tall, I think. Possibly 3 foot wide across the shoulders. And those shoulders were very, very large. I'd say she was about 700 pounds, maybe less. Very, very slender, with a barrel chest, muscular and firm. She looked very human, especially her face, which was very leathery. I think her skin was a tan colour. But my attention was drawn to those deep-set eyes of hers. They were so kind. I knew she wasn't to be feared by then. In a strange way, I felt rather miffed that my husband had had an encounter with Bigfoot, but I wasn't prepared for an encounter all of my own that was to happen a couple of weeks later. I had returned home from my shopping trip at the local town, and the back trunk of my SUV was left wide open, with bags piled on top of each other inside. My cell phone rang. It was my mother, so I began pacing up and down our driveway talking to her, when I suddenly discerned a dark, shadowy figure near the trunk of my car. What was that, I wondered? I had encountered the twins. One little Bigfoot was in my car going through the shopping in an excitable frenzy, rather like a mischievous monkey, tossing anything that it liked towards its brother, who caught it in his wide hands. I noted in his hands he was holding a piece of grapes and a jar of peanut butter. I held my arm up, almost as if I was making a stop sign, rather like a lollipop lady at a pedestrian crossing, and both juvenile Bigfoots obediently stopped in their tracks. They didn't even attempt to run away, which really surprised me. The one critter, who was about 4 foot tall, looked very alarmed. He began swiftly returning my peanut butter and packets of grapes back into their grocery bags, looking rather ridden with guilt. He knew he was in the wrong. While Thumper looked completely mortified to see the foods being replaced into their bags. I guessed immediately that the conscientious twin had to be Acorn. I grabbed a grocery bag, piling it high and very generously with choice foods that they would like, such as peanut butter, grapes, bananas, chips, biscuits, and so much more, which I handed to them. Both twins let out a low-pitched whoop. They were absolutely thrilled. There was no doubt about that in my mind. I think the thing that caught me off guard the most was how remarkably human these Bigfoots were. They looked exactly like kids, only covered in hair, and obviously thicker and stockier, and significantly more muscular, with overlong arms and pyramid-shaped heads. I believe they listened to me because they'd interacted with children before, and knew familiar body language signals from humans. So this was my perfect opportunity to get my message across, and to explain to them that I never wanted them throwing stones at me. I pointed to the taller juvenile and said, "You Thumper," and the creature nodded. And then I turned to the other one and said, "You Acorn," and he nodded. I then picked up a large stone, and I used the Bigfoot word for idiot that Jolene had told me, which is kabook. I pointed to the stone and then to Thumper, and I threw the stone across my yard, demonstrating that such an action was kabook. It was extraordinary, because these Bigfoots knew exactly what I was saying, and Acorn pointed to the stone and to his brother, and I knew he was saying that his brother did not throw stones anymore. Thumper pointed to the stone and to himself, and then shook his head. It was clear he was telling me he didn't throw stones. I think he'd learnt his lesson. I knew they understood exactly what I'd been saying. As Jolene informed me, the Bigfoots are never permanently on our land, but I always leave a bag of shopping out for them every week when I've been doing my shopping, and it's always taken by the twins when they're around, and they're not afraid of me. They wave at me, as if to say thanks. To date, we've never had any problems with Thumper throwing stones in the woods. Occasionally I see an adult Bigfoot fleeing past us, but these sightings are few and far between, because they are very evasive and elusive creatures. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.